There's a place in New Hampshire, far from the maddened crowd, where I used to go hiking alone. The only reminder of civilization I would encounter was a brief glimpse of a pasture where a couple cows occasionally grazed. Somebody I knew must have owned those cows, and so somebody must have lived nearby. And one day, after passing the pasture, I met that somebody. He came running up behind me, shouting, "Sir! Sir, how many cows did you see? How many cows did you see, sir?" I stopped walking and turned with a smile. I lived and worked in the city where the problems were Gordian knots of human entanglement. It gave you ulcers. And this man here, standing in front of me, in muddy overalls and heaving to catch his breath, had a much quainter problem. He had lost a cow. Or so I figured. "I don't know," I said. "I didn't count them." "Would you, sir? Would you go back and count them?" I bit my lip to keep from laughing. "Sure thing, my man." "Thank you, sir," the man gushed as we walked together back down the trail towards the pasture. When we arrived, true to my word, I counted the cows. 12, I replied, turning to the man. "You got 12 cows. You certain? Could you count one more time, just to be absolutely sure?" I was a little insulted at the insinuation that I didn't know how to count, but I humored him. "Oh," I said after taking a recount of the cows. "Guess I missed one. There's 13. 13 cows." I counted again. "Yep, 13 cows." The man groaned. "That's what I thought, sir. I appreciate your time and apologize for the intrusion. Thank you." "That's it?" I asked. I had fully expected him to ask me for help looking for his missing cow, and I was honestly a little disappointed that he hadn't. "Just count the cows?" "That's it," said the man. "Unless you'd like to hear something strange." I set my backpack on the ground, crossed my arms, and nodded. "Lay it on me." "I'm not an educated man, sir, but I know my cows, and I'm telling you, those are not my cows. Even if they were, they couldn't be. I only have 8 cows, not 13. There were 10 there this morning when I woke up. Now, as you could plainly see, there are 13. I thought perhaps I was losing my mind, but you can see them too. 13 cows." I studied the man, looking for some sign that he was putting me on. In my line of work, I often delivered very bad news to people, and the man looked now like those people usually looked when they heard the very bad news. "I almost wish that I really had lost my mind," the man said. "That would at least make sense. Crazy old Abel alone on his farm, imagining cows that aren't there. But this? Sir, I don't know what to make of this. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Cows appearing out of nowhere?" Abel scratched the back of his neck. "Unless you're not real." "Well, sir, are you real?" It was an absurd question, but something about it chilled me and made me take it seriously. Was I real? I looked my hand over and thought about it for a moment. "Yeah," I said, "I'm real." Cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am. Even if there is some evil demon tricking me into thinking that I exist, there has to be something that he's tricking. And I'm that something. Deckard figured all that out a long time ago. "Do you think this is the work of a demon, then?" asked Abel, his eyes opening wide. "I've done my best to live my life free of sin, though I'm only human in the end. Perhaps this is my punishment for some misdeed I've committed." I considered the possibility, but not for long. Cows appearing out of nowhere as a punishment? No, that doesn't make sense. You're basically getting free cows, right? And how's that a punishment? My senses were coming back, and I suddenly felt very silly for ever taking the man seriously. It's silly, but I also pitied him. I imagined him living out there, all alone, slipping into the early stages of dementia. He didn't appear to be that old. In his 50s, if I had to guess. But sometimes it happens at that age. One of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, had developed Alzheimer's in his 50s. "Listen, Abel," I said, "I don't mean to be insulting, but are you quite sure that you only had 8 cows last night when you went to bed?" Yes, said Abel. 8 cows. He then proceeded to list their names, from Adeline to Zelda. I know what you're getting at, sir, but I have evidence. He dug into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I photograph my cows every evening. You may think it's strange, and perhaps it is, but they're all I have anymore. Other people have friends and family to take pictures with, but I'm all alone, other than my cows. So look for yourself. I scrolled through dozens and dozens of photos, checking their timestamps. There were definitely 8 cows in each picture, going back until a month before, when there were 9. The 9th is Bertha, said Abel, as his eyes grew a little watery. She was a good girl, but look here. He zoomed in on one of the cows. That's Lacey? See that unusual spot on her shaped like a bird? Now look at the cows that are here and tell me if you see that spot. These are not my cows. I looked up from the picture, examining the cows in front of me. I couldn't find the mark on any of them. That was disturbing enough, but there was something even more disturbing. Abel? Yes, sir. I see it too. There are now 14 cows. I'm sure there's a completely normal explanation, I said. Not at all sure about that. I tried to suppress the creeping sense of terror worming its way into my head and thinking rationally. The cows probably just came over from a neighboring farm. That 14th cow was probably just hiding behind a tree, and we didn't see it just till now. That's what it is. Sir, the closest dairy farm is in Lancaster. A cow would go lame and collapse in the mountains before she made it from there to here. I needed to sit down, and I crouched in the dirt, trying to come up with some other line of reasoning. Maybe some teenagers were playing a prank on the poor farmer. It'd be an elaborate prank, requiring heavy machinery, but wasn't it possible? I looked out at the cows. Other than the mystery of where they'd come from, something about them seemed off. I stared at them as they stared back at me, and it took me a long time to figure out what was wrong, but then I had it. Abel? Cows are supposed to blink their eyes, right? Yes, sir, that is the truth. Well, these ones aren't blinking. Watch. Abel squinted and scrutinized one of the cows. Well, I'll be, he said, frowning. That's when one of the unblinking cows laid down on the ground and started panting heavily. It looked like it was going to die. She's in labor, said Abel. Labor? As in, she's about to give birth? Yes, sir, she's about ready to pop, all right. Fluid started pouring out of the thing's rear end, and I felt queasy in my city boy stomach. All told, the event did not take long at all. Less time than we spent in dumb shock at what the cow had given birth to. And then finally I spoke. Correct me if I'm wrong, Abel. And I'm certainly not an expert here. But cows don't typically lay eggs. Is that right? That's right, sir. Never seen a cow lay an egg in all my years. The egg was as large as a basketball, and neon green. It started rattling around in the grass. The fuck is going on? I whispered. What the fuck is going on here? Abel opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed his mouth. The cow that had given birth to an egg stood up like nothing had happened and started chewing on some grass. Part of my brain screamed at me to keep walking the mile to my car, get inside, drive off, and forget the whole thing. But the larger part was gaping at the non-blinking cows and the egg and wondering what it all meant. That wasn't a rhetorical question, Abel, I said. Do you have any theories about what's going on here? Abel sighed, looked down at his muddy shoes. Sir, did I ever tell you what happened to my wife? Not the rumors that passed around town, but the truth of the matter. I bit off the sarcastic reply that was forming in my mouth. We had met less than an hour ago, and spent all of our time together counting cows, so no, he hadn't told me about his wife. And said simply, No, my friend. Well, I'd like to hear about it now. I'm the luckiest man that's ever lived, though, to be sure. My luck was short-lived, and the days since that I've been filled with despair. Her name was Beverly. I met her 15 years ago at a farmer's market in town, where I had set up a booth to sell my milk. She was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. And, indeed, by her years, she was not much more than a girl. She was 22. I was 42. Beverly was fresh out of college, and besides being beautiful, she was smart and charming. Meanwhile, I was... Well, you see me now, sir. I'm not much to look at, nor have I ever been mistaken for having a great deal of wit. Got any free samples, she asked, of your milk? I wasn't in the business of giving away free milk, but for her, I couldn't refuse. I was powerless against Beverly's charms that day and every day thereafter, and so I reached into my cooler, brought out a bottle of my finest, and handed it to her. She unscrewed the lid and sniffed the milk. At once, the ironic smile fell from her face, and she grew serious. She lifted the bottle to her lips, took a small drink, and set it down on the display table. This is the purest milk I've ever tasted in my life, she said. I need to see the farm where the milk was made. I closed up my booth immediately. No amount of money was worth passing up the opportunity to spend a moment with this woman. You had to understand, I had no intentions other than simply being in her presence for a time. Now, how could I? How could I pretend to anything more than that? I gave her a tour of my humble farm, tongue-tied the entire time, simply nodding or shaking my head when she asked me a question. At the end of the tour, she announced that this is what she wanted to do. How do you mean? I asked, speaking for the first time since I laid eyes on her. I want to stay here on this farm and live with you. That's how I want to learn about life. You don't even know my name, I said, instantly regretting my foolish objection, but also knew well and true that good fortune doesn't fall from the sky into the laps of folk like me. Well, then tell me your name, she said, taking my hand in hers. Sir, I apologize. I'll come to the point more directly, but I did feel the need to tell you about how it started. It wasn't like they say in town, I didn't drug her and brainwash her or whatever else they claim, nor do I blame them for thinking that I did. There's little else that could explain why she would choose to be my wife unless what she said was actually true. Beverly was convinced that she was an alien from outer space. No, that's not quite right. Not right at all. I apologize and admit that I never quite understood what she was trying to say. She told me that inner space might be a better term for where she came from, and that people had the wrong idea about aliens. They don't live out there on some planet trillions of light years away. They live in the dimensional folds that are right in front of our faces, but we can't see it. Now, I don't know what that means, sir, but it's what she said. Do you think I'm a monster? For taking advantage of someone delusional? It never felt that way. She worked hard every day. She was happy and insisted that it's where she wanted to be and what she wanted to be doing. I never thought that she was an alien, though. Sometimes I almost did, because she had the story down in such dizzying detail, which were lost on me. Mostly, I didn't think about it one way or another. We were together every day and happy, and it didn't matter to me if she was an alien or just a person who thought she was an alien. What mattered was that I loved her, and though I could scarcely believe it, she seemed to love me. Sir, I'm rambling again, forgive me. 5 years ago, Beverly disappeared. Before she did, she said a lot of strange things. And I didn't understand most of them, but I can recall a few suddenly standing here in front of these cows. She told me that she had received warnings from her home world. It was another type of alien, different from her kind, that was planning on coming to our world. This must be stopped at all costs, she said, or they'll destroy your world. She took my hand, our world, Abel. They'll destroy our world. Why would they want to destroy our beautiful world, I asked. They won't want to, they just will. They'll come here thinking that they understand it enough, but they won't understand it enough. They'll try to blend in order to study the world, but they won't quite blend in. And they'll keep coming, one after another, until they fill the entire world. I don't know exactly what it will look like in this dimension, but it's played out before in other places. It's brutal and more awful than any other end you can imagine. They'll just keep coming, and they'll change the world haphazardly until it's no longer recognizable. We don't own this world, I pointed out. Who are we to say what can and can't come into it? Now, you don't understand, Abel, what she said. This will be the end of love. These things will keep pouring in until love is literally no longer possible, and the concept itself no longer exists. It will be very, very bad. I didn't understand what she was saying, except I knew that it would be bad if love didn't exist anymore. I didn't want that to happen. I have to stop them, Beverly said. They're coming tonight. The intelligence on this is clear, and since they only know this world from picking up on my communications, they'll be coming here, to this farm. She put her face in her hands and wept. While I patted her on the shoulder, she dried her eyes. She went on. Yes, I led them there, so I must stop them. I'll go with you, I said, not liking the idea of Beverly going trapezing off into the night alone. And bears roam these woods, as I'm sure that you're well aware of, sir. Very well, said my wife, but I don't know what will happen out there, and before I go, I want you to know something. You taught me what love is. I didn't know before, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And no matter what happens, I want you to know that, and I remember that. I love you too, I said. And then, with almost superhuman speed, she bonked me over the head with a frying pan, and I was out. They said that I must have killed her and buried her body somewhere. They brought in the dogs, they brought the search parties in, but they never found anything, nor do I, and I have been looking for her ever since. And sir, I'll spare you any more of my blubbering. I'll spare you from hearing of the heartache that I've endured these past 5 years. And I'm not telling you this to win your pity, but rather because it occurred to me that maybe Beverly wasn't delusional after all. And maybe what she told me was something to do with these cows. I stood there with my mouth open for some time after Abel had finished telling me his story. I'd been studying him the entire time, and as always, he seemed completely earnest. Still, I wouldn't have given what he said any serious consideration if it hadn't been for these cows. Those fucking non-blinking, egg-laying cows that kept appearing out of nowhere. I turned now to look at them. During the time it took for Abel to tell his story, and the things had more than doubled in number. There were 30 of them now, along with 15 of those neon eggs rattling around, starting to show hairline cracks. I wonder what was inside of them. At the same time, I didn't want to find out. Of all the apocalyptic scenarios I could have imagined, having the world overrun by trans-dimensional cows was probably the dumbest. That meant that it probably was the most likely to actually happen to us. I considered the possibility that maybe we deserved it. Maybe it was our time. And maybe we did deserve it. But something about Abel's story had moved me. As a species, human beings were dumb, selfish, capable of incredible cruelty. But we were also capable of kindness and love. And that seemed worth preserving. We have to stop them, Abel. I think this is what Beverly was talking about. Now, I don't know what happened to her, and I'm sorry for your loss. But we have to stop these cows. Oh, I could never harm a cow, sir. They're not really cows, though. They just look like cows. What are they, then? Hopefully, something that burns, Abel. Hopefully something that burns. I'll have nightmares about that day for the rest of my life. We rode Abel's tractor to his barn and loaded up with every can of gasoline. When we returned to the pasture, the cows had again more than doubled in number. I didn't bother to count them, but they had been well over 100 by that point. We went around and doused them with fuel. It was awful. The cows just let it happen and stared at us with blank, innocent eyes. Tears were flowing freely down Abel's rough face. I had to fight them back myself, trying to focus on the fact that these things were not what they seemed. After the cows and the eggs were attended to, we soaked every inch of grass in the pasture. Then we lit the whole shebang on fire. It was only as they burned, with cow flesh crackling in the flames, that we saw what those creatures really looked like. It was clear then that they were not of this world or even this reality. They were an amalgamation of body parts and ideas. That's the only way that I can describe it. You looked at them and you saw green and purple tentacles writhing around the concept of death and infinity. They were covered in fur and scales and mathematical formulas. They had mechanical gears inside of them and sinew muscles, fat and gristle and glass and triangles. No love. Their bodies burned, smelling like hamburgers and sterility. It sounds impossible and insane, but it's the truth. When there was nothing but ashes in front of us, I turned to Abel. I don't know if it was enough, but it was all we could do. We did our best, buddy. We did what we had to. You did wonderfully. I whipped my head around, and there, standing behind us, was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, dressed in a long white robe. Her beauty hurt. And now I did start crying, uncontrollably. Beverly! Cried Abel. My love! Where have you been? Oh, it doesn't matter. You're here now. I've been at the gate, said Beverly, for 5 years. According to time here, much longer in reality. I was able to hold them off for a long time, but finally, it got to where I couldn't do it myself anymore. They broke through, and they will again, unless... I never wanted it to come to this. Unless what? I asked. What do we have to do to stop these things for good? Beverly smiled sadly. It broke my heart to see her sad. I didn't know her at all. She was apparently some kind of trans-dimensional being herself, but it still broke my heart. I thought that the memory of love would be enough, she said. And for a time it was. But it's not anymore. I need someone there. I need an active, living love. You need Abel, I said. Beverly nodded. The gate is a terrible place. Fully of horrors beyond comprehension. I never wanted Abel to have to go there. I wanted him to stay here and be happy with his cows and his memory of love, but I need him. I'll go anywhere with you, my love, anywhere. Abel and Beverly embraced, and for a moment, the evening sky seemed to brighten. When they separated, Beverly turned to me. Thank you for helping Abel. If you hadn't passed by the farm at that exact moment, I'm confident that it would have been too late for this world. She reached out her hand. I took it in mine and felt a gushy warmth course through me. Don't mention it, I said. Thank you, sir, said Abel, overcome with emotion. Sir, I must thank you. He wrapped his meaty arms around me and pulled me in for a bear hug. You take care now, buddy, he said, patting him on the back. Then Abel went to stand by Beverly's side. They held hands and began to melt into each other, intertwining, turning inside into one gooey mess of flesh and organs and everything else that they were made of, and then they were gone. I have not been the same since that day, and as I've said, they're the nightmares. Nightmares of unfathomable beings filling every inch of the world, and nightmares of the gate. Somehow I can see the gate clearly in my mind as I sleep, and I think it must be because Beverly touched me. It's an awful place, infinite, full of infinite terrors. And then, too, there's the loneliness. I've witnessed a love more powerful than I thought possible, but I'm not a part of it. I long to be part of it, but I live in alienation, alone, both physically. I quit my job and moved to the desert, and in the knowledge of just how small and fragile this reality is. The other day I made the decision that it's time to move on and live my life again. That meant going back to Abel's farm for the first time and making peace with what happened there. When I arrived, I stood looking at the pasture. The grass had never grown back, and I knew never would. I stood there for a long time, replaying that day in my head. I thought back to Abel's story and about how he had lived with Beverly for 10 years. He had known that tremendous love every day for 10 years, and then when she disappeared, he was suddenly alone. But he hadn't given up. He'd gone on tending to the cows, he'd gone on taking care of Adeline, and Bertha, and Zelda, taking photographs of them every night. That gave him strength. After several hours there, I felt refreshed. In the deepest way, and I decided I decided to go along my old hiking path as a symbolic way to restart my life. I wasn't very far along the trail when I saw it, so it was impossible to miss. A fragment of a shell, neon green, unlike anything occurring naturally in this world. We'd missed one. It must have rolled away in the chaos. I bent down and I picked it up between my fingers. It was still warm. I heard a branch snap deep in the woods, and then heard a voice deep in my mind, cold and alien. That wasn't very nice, what you did to us. And I got out of there. Fast. Foraging. It used to be an everyday necessity many 100 years ago. To be able to understand the local flora of where one lived and learning the difference between edible and poisonous plants was one of the only educational lessons that mattered. Nowadays, however, there's no need to have to learn the ways of the local plant life. The rise of agriculture and grocery stores provides us with all the food that we will ever need now. Despite this, though, I began to develop a fascination with foraging once I turned 16. Something about the idea of being able to provide for myself in the wild, if ever need be, soothed some primal lizard brain anxiety within me. So in light of the newfound passion, I began to purchase books about edible and medicinal plants in the region of the Midwest, where I live. The books were helpful due to the fact that they not only helped identify plants, they also disclosed where, how, and when to forage them. It honestly was so fascinating discovering how many of the common plants I see every day are actually edible or have medicinal value. I've always loved nature, but learning about how to safely interact with its plant life really seemed to help me become more in tune with my surroundings. Knowing what I know now, though, I wish I never had taken an interest in foraging. I wish I never decided to leave the house that day. I wish I never decided to take Hazel with me. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. To be quite honest, I know I am just stalling giving all this backstory. I think I still haven't quite fully processed and accepted the events of that day. Still so much to bear. So much horror to remember. I guess that's why I decided to write this out. To hopefully clear some of the fogginess and agonized screams from my head. Anyway, I better just get writing and get this over with. Here's my story. It all happened 2 weeks ago, on Tuesday, July 7th, 2020. And by now, I'd reached the point in summer where I didn't know what to do with myself. And with the addition of spring quarantine due to COVID-19, I was dangerously close to reaching my boredom breaking point. I was flipping through some of my foraging books when I came across a page about blackberries. I read about how around this time of year was a good time to start picking blackberries, and then, of course, it struck up the idea that I should go blackberry picking. The memory of a certain forest preserve I walked past a couple days ago where I saw an abundance of blackberry vines and bushes popped into my head. A little shot of exhilaration zipped through my veins at the thought of going foraging, and I quickly called up my good friend Hazel to invite her to come with me. And she agreed, just as enthusiastic about the idea as I was. And it wasn't long before both her and me were in my car and on our way to the forest preserve. I had been friends with Hazel ever since the first grade. She had a full head of curly ginger hair, beautiful amber eyes, and a pale face full of freckles. Her and I both bonded over our passion for nature, and that connection had kept us close for many years. Whenever I felt like going adventuring, I always made sure to extend the invitation to Hazel. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't developed feelings for her over the years. She was just so amazing in every facet. Her personality, her looks, her energy. All of her. Thinking about her now only leaves me with pain, though. Feels as though that one of the monstrosities, thorns, is stuck in my heart. I can't remove it, and I can't remove it. We arrived at the forest preserve in the late evening, right as the sun was starting to dip lower on the sky, leaving the forest in a golden glow that wouldn't last for more than an hour. "We should try to be quick about this," Hazel stated. "We shouldn't be out too long after dark." "Yeah, you're right," I agreed. "We can go back to my house once we've finished picking enough berries and maybe make some scones, or pie." Hazel smiled, her gorgeous smile, and nodded. We proceeded further into the preserve, following the path where I remember a lot of blackberry vines growing. Both of us had brought wicker baskets lined with a couple layers of cheesecloth to prevent the berries from staining anything. I remember the night so vividly now, and how peaceful it was. How beautiful. Hazel looked in the last golden rays of the day, the way her amber eyes sparkled in the sun for the last time. How could anything so amazing end the way it did? It was getting dark by the time we reached the grove. The last bits of sunlight slowly retreated to darkness. I hadn't been in this part of the preserve before due to the fact that you could only access it through a series of obscure paths that I didn't even know existed until that night. I didn't think either of us even really remembered the paths we took to get there due to the fact that we were just following where the blackberry vines took us. Both her and I stopped in awe at the sight before us. There was a circular clearing in the middle of the forest, and in that clearing, must have been hundreds of blackberry vines. They were intertwined and locked in ways that made them look like one huge writhing mass. It was a couple of minutes before Hazel finally piped up. "This is awesome!" she squealed in delight while jumping up and down with a huge grin plastered over her face. "We'll have enough berries to last us until next July." "We sure will," I laughed in response to her joyful outburst. "But our baskets are already pretty full and it's getting pretty dark. Let's pick for a little longer and explore, but then we have to go back home. We can return another time." Hazel nodded excitedly at my response. I'm not sure how much of it actually went through her head, but it was acknowledgement nonetheless. We split up, each exploring and picking berries at our own section of the grove. I noticed Hazel was venturing deeper into the grove's center, awkwardly stepping over vines and shifting her body to avoid getting pricked by other thorns. I looked up from picking my own berries every so often to check out her and make sure she didn't trip, fall, or get stuck. I looked up to check on her one more time once my basket was filled to the brim, ready to call her back so we could make our way to the car. But stopped dead before I could even voice a word. Hazel was standing on the center of the grove, a look of confusion and slight worry plastered on her face, looking down on something. Concerned, I began to make my way to her, awkwardly maneuvering my way around the thorned vines. And once I reached the center of the grove, I looked at Hazel and gave her a worried look. She didn't even look up at me. She seemed to be fixated on whatever she was staring at. I followed her gaze to meet what was transfixing her, and it wasn't long before the same look on Hazel's face was reflected onto my own. At first glance, the bush looked just like any other blackberry bush we had seen. But the more you looked at it, the weirder things got. The stem and branches of the bush weren't the normal solid green of the other blackberry vines, and the bushes around it. I mean, yes, the vines were still green, but it was more of a translucent green, which revealed what looked like red veins running up and down under the skin of the plant's stems. Although red veins on a plant isn't something that's super uncommon, these were something different. The veins reminded me too much of the veins that you could see under the surface of human skin. The longer you looked at the veins, the more it looked like they seemed to be moving. It was as though the plant had blood flowing through it, like it would in a human body. The veins seemed to expand, contract, just slightly enough to be noticeable if you watched for long enough. In addition to this, attached to each stem, every 1/4 an inch or so, were large, hook-shaped thorns that shone a deep purplish red. Each thorn seemed to have its own vein attached to it under the skin of the stem. I guess this was likely where the deep purplish red color of the thorns came from. The leaves also seemed to have a similar appearance to the stems, with red veins that moved ever so slightly under the surface. The leaves themselves also seemed to be shaped differently from the bushes around it. They were larger, longer, and had serrated edges. The leaves looked so sharp, in fact, I was convinced that if I touched the leaves, they would pierce my skin with ease. Finally, there were the berries. Instead of there being multiple berries on one branch, there was only one hanging off the very tip of select branches. They were much larger than the berries of the surrounding bushes, but still shone the same deep purple color of a ripe blackberry. The strangest thing, though, was that in the center of each berry was one druplet that was 3 times the size of the rest of the druplets that made up the blackberry fruit. This one large druplet was divided into 2 by a horizontal slit that twitched slightly every so often in a way that reminded me of a muscle spasm. The whole bush itself gave off a strong odor of rotting fruit, despite the fact that all its fruit seemed to be at perfect ripeness, and pulsed with an energy I can only describe as malicious. After several minutes of silence, both Hazel and I simultaneously looked to each other with looks of serious concern and disgust. By this point, we both had noticed the smell and were covering our noses to try and block out the stench. "What in the holy hell is this thing?" Hazel exclaimed, disgust dripping in her tone. "I have no idea," I responded, equally disgusted and also slightly worried. "Did you notice the weird veins?" she quizzed. "Yeah," I responded. "They remind me of human veins." "Yeah, they do," she whispered back softly. I could see she had a plan hatching behind Hazel's amber eyes, one I was not so sure I was going to like. The idea of messing with this plant filled me with a dread I can't quite explain. "I'm going to break one of the stems, see if any liquid pours out," she declared with certainty. "I don't think that's such a good idea. This thing seems really wrong. What if it's poisonous?" I countered, my voice laced with caution and worry. Hazel seemed to consider my words for a moment before her face lit up, as though she remembered something. She pulled out a pair of brown leather cloths that were clipped to her belt, ones that I hadn't noticed before. "Here, I can wear these," she stated matter-of-factly. I was hesitant. Still not sure if touching it at all was such a good idea, but I just nodded, said nothing. God, I should have said something. I should have dragged her out of that grove and to the car, fighting tooth and nail if I had to, but I didn't. Now I've paid the price for my ignorance. Hazel put on the gloves, reached forward, grabbed one of the thicker stems where a lot of veins were visible and snapped it. For a moment there was nothing. And then thick, red liquid spurted out of the broken stem. The wound was bleeding as violently as a slashed human artery, covering Hazel in the gooey red substance that I now know to be human blood. The rest seemed to play out in slow motion. Hazel was swooped up by one of the plant's vines, lifting her high enough into the air so that I couldn't reach her. She screamed in agony as huge curved thorns tore into the flesh of her torso. I was so surprised that I couldn't even scream, let alone form any words. It wasn't long until several more vines shot up from the plant and wrapped around each of her limbs, stretching them out and holding them so she couldn't struggle or even move. Blood poured from where the vines connected with her flesh, dripping to the ground in a steady stream, similar to a shower with poor pressure. Her screams only became more tormented now due to the fact that they had grown to include notes of hoarseness as her vocal cords tore themselves apart, alongside what sounded like her choking on whatever fluid was filling her throat at the time. Still, I couldn't say anything. I couldn't even move. All my terrified body would let me do was watch the scene unfold in front of me. The plant had one last area it needed to restrain. Her head. And after a single vine shot up to wrap around her forehead, locking her head in place, streams of blood flowed from where flesh and thorn connected, making it look as though her own tears were made of blood. The only reason I could imagine for why it didn't just go for her neck was because the plant wanted her alive for this next part. The vines that had berries on them now began to join the horrid affair. Slowly, the large centered drupelets of berries opened their horizontal lids and revealed human eyes, all of varying shades of color, shape, and decomposition. They were lifted up to Hazel's face by green tendrils that extended from the tips of the berries corresponding to the vines. There must have been at least 20 eye berries protruding from the bush. The eyeberries were feverishly examining her face, but more specifically, her eyes. Hazel tried to close her eyelids to protect her eyes from whatever the horror planned to do with them, but it would not have any of it. Several thin tendrils shot up from the bush, all of which had no berries attached. They forced her eyelids open. It was only a matter of seconds before Hazel's amber eyes were exposed to the peering plant once again. By this point, Hazel's voice had seemed to give, and the only sounds she could make included whimpering and gurgling. Her face was contorted into an expression filled with pain and fear. Her eyes showed this moment of all, however. They were filled with so many emotions I can only imagine what she felt in that moment. What was most twisted about all of this, though, was the fact that I could tell the plant was soaking up her pain with glee. The eyeberries wriggled around happily, almost as if they were dancing to her pain, soaking up every drop of her agonized expression. I wanted to do something. I wanted to rip that monstrosity out of the ground, tear it apart, but I couldn't. I was still trapped in my own mind, unable to move even a finger, in fear that the plant may notice me too. It was then that the horror began its next phase. All the eyeberries seemed to stop wriggling, stop scouring every inch of Hazel's form. They had come to a decision that would haunt me to the end of my days, a decision about what to do with Hazel. The eyeberries turned their forms to look down at the center, and both Hazel and I followed their gaze. From the center of the bush sprouted what must have been hundreds of thin, little green, writhing tendrils. And these tendrils were different from any of the others because of the fact they were extremely thin, no thicker than a fishing line, and seemed to work as a hive mind as the thin tendrils made their way up to Hazel's face. The eyeberries followed their movement. They didn't want to miss a second of the event. The tendrils examined Hazel's eyes, just like the eyeberries did. Except I could tell the tendrils weren't emotionally fascinated by her eyes like the eyeberries were. They were more focused on mapping and understanding the anatomy of Hazel's two eyes. They poked and prodded her eyes in 1,000 different places, and each time they did, a separate whimper escaped Hazel's lips. This went on for a little while, and it wasn't until all the tendrils seemed to have gotten a feel for every part of Hazel's eyes did they stop. There were a few moments of silence, where every part of the plant seemed to hold as still as possible. I knew that this moment was the calm before the storm, and my suspicions were confirmed once the first tendril shot forward and buried itself in the corner of Hazel's eyes. A muffled scream rang out of Hazel's lips as the thousands of tiny tendrils followed the first lead, latching themselves along the edges of both Hazel's eyes. I watched in horror as all of the tendrils found their places and began to pull outward. It became apparent to me now what they were trying to do. They were trying to pull Hazel's eyes out. Hazel's shrieks rang through the air once more, sending a new shockwave of unrelenting terror through my body. I watched as Hazel's eyes bulged from her head as the tendrils fought with her body for their own ownership, and with a sickening snap, her left eye popped from her eye socket, followed by another snap from her right eye. Her body fell limp as I watched the eyeberries wiggle with excitement. The tendrils quickly handed over what used to be Hazel's eyes to the eyeberries before returning to Hazel's body for more deconstruction. The thousands of tiny tendrils entered Hazel's eye sockets, causing Hazel's body to twitch as they explored all the veins, organs, and arteries. At this point, it became obvious the tendrils were draining her body of blood, as their light green color quickly turned a deep red as they transferred the precious liquid to the center of the organism. During all this, the eyeberries wasted no time in finding a new home for Hazel's eyes. They carried the eyes as though they were crowd surfing at a concert. They were the star. Down the rest of the plant, 2 unripe eyeberries, which had not come to life during the massacre, revealed themselves in the presence of the eyes. They were attached to vines that looked younger than the vines the alive eyeberries were attached to. As well as this, these berries also did not have a large druplet in their center. It was apparent this was because those berries did not have any eyes to call their own yet. But that was about to change. The wriggling eyeberries passed Hazel's detached amber eyes into their unripe counterparts, and they were absorbed, hungrily. It wasn't long before their large center druplets formed, and the newborn pair of eyeberries saw the world for the first time. with their stolen eyes. I locked eyes with the newborn berries, and I felt my stomach twist into a knot at the sight of Hazel's still bloody eyes being used by those monstrosities. We stayed there, eyes locked for what felt like centuries. It wasn't until I heard a sickening thud from next to me that I turned away from my grotesque staring contest. Hazel's drained body was splayed out before me, eyes empty, skin ghostly pale, emptied of all blood. All of her previous light and liveliness was gone, now replaced by a shell of what she used to be. Bile rose in my throat and I became sick, vomiting out all the previous blackberries I ate that night onto the soil. And when I finally looked up, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. All the eyeberries had turned to stare at me, cold, calculating, and unblinking. It was obvious this was the first time any of them noticed me, and were now deciding what to do about me next. I wasn't going to give them a chance. Before I knew it, I was on my feet and bolting for the direction of my car. Now in control of my muscles once more, I was halfway expecting to feel the eyeberry vines wrapping around my feet and dragging me to a similar demise. But that didn't happen. I don't really remember what happened after that. One minute, I was frantically slamming my keys into the ignition and peeling out of the preserve's parking lot. The next, I was in my mother's arms, sobbing and spouting gibberish nonsense to her while she tried to understand what happened. I was rushed to the hospital after that. Apparently, I'd gotten some deep enough cuts to need stitches on my leg from running through the blackberry groves back to my car. The next morning, I gave my statement to the police. I told them everything I told you. They obviously thought I was crazy, but still went to investigate my claims just in case. They couldn't find any evidence of my story. The only thing they found was the blackberry grove. No eyeberry bush. No Hazel. The only thing they found to prove that I was ever there in the grove in the first place were torn pieces of my clothing that got stuck on thorns of blackberry bushes following my escape path. And this left me the only suspect regarding the disappearance of Hazel. And because of this, I'm still being investigated to this day. I have no idea where the eyeberry bush could have gone, or what it did to the rest of Hazel, but I also know this. It's not done with me yet. When I returned home yesterday from yet another police interview, I was met with something that caused me to freeze in my tracks. It was one human eye. I know it was not one of Hazel's because it was too badly decomposed and had blue irises, but this is not the point. This freak of nature is sending me a message. My eyes are the same shade of blue as the one now sitting on my desk. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the monstrosity is telling me that it is in need of some new eyes. And that I am the perfect prey. From the moment I bought the lottery ticket, it didn't feel right. I never spent money on lottery tickets and thought they were a waste of money. But a sign on the street corner caught my eye when I was walking home from work one day. Community lottery. Money raised goes to a good cause. Current jackpot, $2,234,423. I was intrigued for some reason. It was a lot of money, and I didn't imagine a lot of people were playing since it looked like a small operation. I went inside, and a small old man with a fine mustache stood behind the counter. The store looked a little rough inside. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the shelves were half bare. It smelled a bit like mildew and spoiled meat. The shopkeeper smiled at me warmly as I walked up to the counter, the light dancing in his eyes behind his round spectacles. He wore a distinctive black suit with gold cuffs and a collar. "Welcome, welcome. What can I do for you?" he said in a friendly tone. I saw your sign outside and I wanted to buy a few tickets for the lottery, I said. Of course. All money raised goes to a good cause. $2 for one, $5 for three, $10 gets you 7 tickets. How many do you want? He was pulling a crisp stack of tickets. Their faces appeared to have been inked by hand, but that wasn't possible considering the size of the jackpot, I thought. They had to have been stamped. Yet each one looked unique and different. They weren't numbered. They looked like Rorschach tests, each one a unique black blotch of ink. I was feeling lucky. I told him I'd take as many as $50 would get me. There wasn't a price break past $10, so I ended up with 35 tickets. I flipped through them, amazed at how different they each were. Good luck! And remember, all money raised goes to a good cause. The man's face was bemused. His mouth turned up at the corners into a little smile. Anything I should know? How do I find out if I've won? Asked the man. His brow wrinkled. His face looked annoyed by the question. I never played this lottery before. It seems a bit strange. Someone will tell you if you win. Don't worry, he said cryptically. I didn't understand how they'd find me, but he refused to take any of my information. I left the store feeling like I had been ripped off. $50 for a handful of black and white tickets with cool designs on them didn't seem like a very good deal. I was experiencing buyer's remorse for the first time in years as I walked home. I was usually very frugal. I couldn't help but wonder what they had gotten me into. A week later, somebody came to my door. It was another old man wearing the same black suit trimmed with gold as the shopkeeper. He was holding a ticket with a black abstract pattern on it, like a Rorschach test. He didn't say a word. He just held up the piece of paper and stood there, smiling. The black splotch looked like a devious little monkey, and I recognized it immediately. I ran upstairs, excited, and grabbed my stack of tickets. I shuffled through them and found one that matched. I made a high-pitched yell of excitement. I was rich! I waved the ticket with the monkey ink splotch on it above my head and danced. I had never won anything before in my life. I couldn't believe it. I brought the whole stack of tickets down with me, just in case, but kept the monkey one separate. I showed it to him, and he smiled, nodding his head. He took a check out of his pocket and handed it to me with a flourish, and then began to walk away. It was a check for $2,200. Furious, I tried to contain my anger. I ran up in front of the man and cut off his hasty escape. He looked surprised. I told him the sign had said the prize was over $2 million. $2,200 was a long way away from that. Money goes to a good cause. You are not a good cause. You take $2,200 and be happy, the man said. I couldn't believe my ears. His smile had faded and he looked very serious now, as if I had broken some unspoken contract. I thought of a 50-50 draw at a stag and doe, or at a charity event where the winner was expected to donate their winnings to the cause. Was that what this was? I thought of the man's words. All money goes to a good cause. I hadn't even bothered to ask the name of the charity. Listen, if you try to screw me here, I'll come after you guys for false advertising. I see what you're trying to pull. I won this thing fair and square. Now give me what's mine, I told him, gritting my teeth. I had never been a greedy person, but the idea of $2 million that was rightfully mine being taken from me rubbed me the wrong way and brought out a very bad side of me. I had already mentally begun to spend the money and felt robbed, cheated. If I wanted to give some of it to their charity, well, that was my decision to make, a greedy and unfair little monster's voice said inside of my head. He furrowed his brow. His eyes looked sad for a second, but he reached into his pocket and he pulled out another check. He pulled the other one away and handed me this one instead. The amount written on it was $2,234,423. I jumped up and down, giddy with delight. When I opened my eyes again, the man was gone. I couldn't believe my luck. I had thought that I would only get half that amount, at the very most, after some negotiating. No one contacted me to ask if I wanted to have my picture taken with a big cardboard check, and I was a bit disappointed. But I decided that I wouldn't let it bother me. I had over $2 million to spend on whatever I wanted. No one called to ask me to donate a portion of it to the organization's charitable cause, but I just assumed that they would send something by mail. First things first, I thought. I called my job. I quit, without notice, playing punk rock on my laptop as I did so, and singing "Take This Job and Shove It" out loud as the hold music played in my ear. I sang the lyrics to my manager, letting him know I ain't working there no more. My boss was furious, but I just hung up on him. "Holiday in Cambodia" came on the playlist next, and I listened to the furiously jovial tunes with a big smile on my face as I lay on the couch. It felt good to be in charge of my own destiny for once. Or so I thought. I went to the bank to deposit the check. After talking to the managers for a while, they made a phone call and confirmed the check was real. Probably should have checked that first before quitting. They told me that it would take a little while to clear, and said that I would have to wait a week or two to spend any money. Well, I sat around my apartment for a couple of weeks playing video games, watching old movies, and enjoying the unemployed lifestyle for the soon-to-be rich and famous. Finally, the bank called and said that I could play with my cash. The manager tried to tell me something else, but I hung up on him before he could waste any more of my time. The guy's voice was dry and boring, and suddenly I had no attention span for boring. After a lifetime of normality, I was ready to have some fun. I went to the BMW dealership first. I had always wanted one and decided that I would treat myself to an M5. They obliged, and I burnt rubber out of the car lot watching their surprised faces as I drove away. The car had a lot of torque and was tough to control due to my lack of experience with high-performance vehicles. I didn't let that bother me, though, and I gunned it down the main road until the cops pulled me over and gave me a hefty speeding ticket. The price of it didn't bother me, but the points against my license did. I already had a couple recent speeding tickets from my prior infractions, and the cop told me with the most recent mistake I would need to go in front of a judge to plead my case for why I should keep my license. I bit my tongue and I tried not to scream at him. My license could be revoked for up to 6 months if the judge decided I didn't need it that bad, or wasn't remorseful enough. I tried not to worry about it too much, but 2 weeks later my license was revoked. The judge hadn't liked my attitude, apparently. To get the bad taste of that experience out of my mouth, I contacted a real estate agent. I was in the market for a house, I told her. Something big, with a pool, the greedy little voice inside my head said. She showed me a few options, and I settled on the nicest one of the bunch. Cost a cool $1 million, but it was worth it. I spent another day shopping and filling the house with the top-of-the-line electronics and comfortable leather furniture, a pool table, a Pac-Man vintage tabletop game, and outfitted the back deck with a gigantic Weber barbecue with a buttload of BTWs. After all the shopping, I gave some money to a friend and family who began to hound me for cash to help them pay down their own debts and replace aging and broken-down vehicles that, they'd always been good to me, so I felt guilty by saying no. I had some student loan debt, so I wiped that out with a sigh of relief as well. I had a terrible feeling when I logged onto my bank account and realized how much I had spent. I knew I was no longer a millionaire, but I was surprised to see the balance was $655,573.24. I had spent 2/3 of the money in 3 weeks. But at least I had a sweet ride, a great house to show for it, I thought. I made a mental tally of all the things that I had purchased and tried to make myself feel better. But I couldn't. I felt empty and hollow inside. I couldn't understand the feeling, and I tried desperately to get rid of it. I took a trip to Hawaii. I got sick the day I arrived with a virus the doctors couldn't find out. My travel insurance covered the hospital bills for the most part, but the vacation was a bust. I came home a month later after spending all that time in the hospital. I hadn't even been to a beach while I was on my trip. I was so sick I couldn't spend more than 10 minutes out of bed. Wounds and bed sores developed all over me, and my skin became paper thin from the steroids the doctor prescribed to try to fight the illness. I got a cut on my foot the day I got home, and it stubbornly refused to heal. I wouldn't even stop bleeding. It quickly became infected. I ended up in the hospital again, this time in an isolation room as my wound picked up another infection and resistant to antibiotics. It's perfect, I thought. Just one more thing. What else could go wrong? I started to regret not just keeping the check for $2,200. I was beginning to get the feeling my life perhaps would have been better if I had. This all felt like a punishment. The greedy voice inside told me I was wrong, but I didn't trust it. My friends and family abandoned me. They stopped visiting. I'd become stingy with my remaining money, and they resented me for it. They said that I had changed, that I was greedy and indifferent to them. All I wanted was to keep some of the wealth as a nest egg, I told them. Was that so bad? I was finally discharged from the hospital. I had lost 70 pounds. I was emaciated and weak. I could barely walk. Just getting out of bed exhausted me. When I got home, I tried to enjoy my big house. But it was too large to get around. Now that I was deconditioned from my long hospital stay, I had to get a nurse and a personal support worker to help me bathe and do housework. I had no strength left suddenly. I felt used up and hopeless. I was afraid to look at my bank account and how the money in there was no good. It was toxic. One night, lying in bed, restless as I wriggled and squirmed, trying to find a way to ignore the pain from the bed sores, I decided I should give the money back. Something told me that was the way to fix things. I sold the house. I brought the BMW back to the dealership. After selling everything else of value, I ended up around $1.8 million back in my bank. Felt like I needed to return the rest as well, but I was in no state to do any physical labor in order to make money. Probably take 20 years to save up the amount I needed to pay it all back, I thought. I prayed the men in black and gold would forgive me and return my life to normal somehow. I called each member of the family. I told them more or less what I planned to do, fudging the details only slightly. I said I planned to give all the money back to charity. I thought they would be angry, but everyone told me I was making the right decision. I said the money had changed me, and certainly not for the better. I made my way back to the little shop the next morning with the help of my PSW. It drove me there and helped me inside my wheelchair. The man at the counter was not the same. My heart dropped immediately. He was dressed in a white t-shirt, said Florida on it, and blue jeans. He spoke in a twangy southern drawl, and when I asked about the lottery, he said he had no clue what I was talking about. "We got all kinds of scratchers, that's what you're after," he said, pulling out the scratch and win tickets from beneath the plastic countertop. I shook my head. I thanked him for his time. We left the shop, and I realized I had no clue what to do next. I knew I had to give the money back, but how would I find the men in the black suits with the gold trim? I stopped a woman walking by and asked if she knew the people who owned the shop before, the ones who ran the community lotto. The woman shrugged. She said she'd lived there for years, but had never heard of such a thing. I looked around and saw the street looked worse than it had the day before I bought the ticket, only a couple months before. The people looked sadder. The buildings were dirtier. They looked in disrepair. Cars on the street belched thick gray smoke and rattled over potholes. Homeless people clustered on a corner where a little shanty was erected. Windows were boarded up and abandoned. Storefront windows were smashed, left unrepaired. Broken glass still laid scattered on the sidewalk. I went home, anxious and upset. I needed to find the men in black suits with gold trim. It was the only way to get my life back, I thought. In my motel room that night, I lay in bed, cold and scared. It didn't seem to matter how many blankets I put on. I could never seem to stay warm. I had never put back on any of the weight I'd lost. In fact, I lost more every week. I couldn't keep food down. I had never-ending nausea. I thought I had cancer, but all the tests came back negative at the hospital when I was there. It still felt like something horrible was festering and growing inside me. The greedy little monster voice was always there in my head, but I now ignored him and all his awful desires. Still, he whispered to me constantly. "The greedy thing inside you will eat you up," a voice said from the shadows in the corner of my dark room. The clock on my bedside table said 3:23 a.m. I tried to call for help, but my voice came out as a strangled whisper. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The light danced in the eyes of the man in the shadows, although there was no light in the room to be reflected. I saw him step forward out of the darkness. His smile was bemused, still barely visible. "You should have kept your winnings when they were offered," he said. "I'm sorry," I managed, tears streaming down my face. "What can I do? I want to give it back. Let me give it back." "You have all of it?" he asked, with a sly and knowing look in his eyes that said he knew I didn't. "I tried, but I have most of it. Over 1,800,000. Please, take it back. I don't want it." My words sounded pathetic to my own ears, but I didn't care. I only hoped that he would accept. He didn't. "You must give it all back. The horde must be whole. To tip back the scales so they rest even once again. How? Just tell me what to do, I'll do it, I pleaded with him desperately. There are many ways to make $1. Find one of them, then do it again and again until it's whole again. His face looked a little gleeful. The bastard was enjoying this. I can't, don't you understand? It's impossible. I'll die before I can make $10. I was angry, but I tried to plead once more with him. But there must be some other way, please. I'll do anything, anything. My voice came out a whisper. Well, the man said, playing with the corners of his fine mustache. You have one other option, although you may not like it. The next day I went to the address where the man had told me to go. I walked in. They gave me a hospital gown, although this was no hospital. I was directed to lie flat on a cold steel table and told the doctor would be in shortly. The man who came in was wearing black scrubs and gold trim. He introduced himself as Dr. Gold. An assistant came in next, an older woman in glasses, dressed the same. She said her name was Nurse Black. They told me what would be done, and I said that would be fine. Whatever I had to do to get my life back, I would do it. They explained they no longer had an anesthesiologist. He had paid his debt, so I would be awake for the procedure. They scrubbed large swaths of my body with a disinfectant that turned my skin pink. Then they began to cut. The scalpel left a red trail of blossoming blood wherever it went. And soon, the stuff was everywhere. Nurse Black mopped it up calmly with clean towels, wiping the sweat from Dr. Gold's brow every so often. I screamed and wept. I gnashed my teeth and pounded my fists into the hard steel table as they reached into my body, severing arteries and veins, pulling out slippery, bloody-soaked organs, which shone like rubies in the bright light of the overwhelming lamp. I passed out as they cut off a portion of my lung. When I felt like I could suddenly no longer breathe, the doctor looked around with wide eyes for a moment as if he'd made a bad mistake. I woke up once more and wished I hadn't. What I saw should not have been seen. The price of my organs in the black market didn't quite cover the cost of my mistakes, Dr. Gold said as my eyes fluttered open. His words were fading in and out, and I nodded my head when he asked me a question, though I didn't understand it. He handed me a pen, and I took it in my shaking hand. I remember signing something, but I didn't read what it said. I wish I could tell you things worked out for me. I really do, and maybe they will someday. I only wish they told me what a crappy rate people pay for black market organs. I'd rather have had my kidney and my left eye than $20,000 wiped from my debt. I had to pay the rest back in labor anyway. At least they pulled a little monster out of me, kicking and screaming, a tiny, inky black monkey made of greed and hate, screeching and howling as it dug its claws into my belly in a futile attempt to stay inside me, to destroy me. It's the last thing I saw before the world went dark. Maybe one day I'll get to work behind a counter somewhere selling tickets. But for now, I'm only tasked with inking them. Each blotch of ink has to be distinctive and different. There's thousands, millions of tickets to make. They don't give us breaks either. We live at our desks, receiving whippings to the back from a cat o' nine tails when we fall asleep or slow down. They have IVs hanging from the ceiling full of vitamins and amphetamines, which infuse us all day long as we hunch over our desks, until the cost of the fluids and amphetamines are added to our debt every day, and it just keeps growing and growing. But that's just rumor. No one gets to see their balance. People disappear sometimes. We hope they paid their debt and didn't just die of exhaustion. I look ahead and I see rows of people potting away at their desks, fading into the distance. This warehouse, whatever it is, it's enormous. There are thousands of us here, all dressed in black with gold cuffs and collars. Someone smuggled in this phone the other day. We've been discreet, passing it around, making fruitless efforts to contact the outside world, so I decided to use it to tell my story. And to plead with you. To beg you. Please help. Send money. Desmond Bryant stepped into the office with a heavy sigh. Frowning at the shark-like grin his boss, John Mason, was flashing him. The smile was large and obscene, and made Desmond extremely nervous. He'd been summoned from the basement hovel he called an office up to the hallowed halls of the top floor, and that could only mean one thing. He was about to be handed another shitty assignment. Come in, John said, his toothy grin growing wider. Take a seat, Desmond, my boy, take a seat. With another sigh, Desmond plunked himself down at John's desk, but said nothing, glaring at his boss with an open dislike. At this, John burst out laughing. How's the new office? He said, lighting up a cigar and blowing luxurious clouds of smoke into the air. You settling in all right? It's a goddamn shithole, Desmond snapped, and you know it. And you shouldn't have been a bad boy, John replied, blowing a cloud of acrid-smelling smoke right into Desmond's face. Bringing into a crime scene is an arrestable offense. If I hadn't pulled the right strings, you could have been looking at some serious time. You pulled strings to cover your ass. Story of the century, you said. Do whatever it takes to get the scoop. Your words, not mine. But you broke the cardinal rule, John replied, pointing a nicotine-stained finger in Desmond's face. You got caught, son. You got caught. And so you punish me by taking me off the paper and having me report for that shitty-ass magazine of yours, Bigfoot, and flying saucers, mutant babies, dog boys. The whole thing is a joke. That shitty magazine, as you call it, John said, slamming a meaty hand on his desk, is where I got my start. I built it myself from the ground up, from nothing, and it still sells more copies a month than that Daily Teller does a week. You can think of it as a demotion if you like, but I tell you, it's more of a cooling-off period. The board wanted your ass, and if you weren't such a good reporter, I'd have handed it to him. But you're on shaky ground, boy. You just better believe you're on shaky ground. Okay, Desmond said, slumping his shoulders in defeat. I guess a thank you is in order. What was that? John said, chewing the end of his cigar furiously. I didn't quite catch you. Thank you, Desmond said again, with as much grace as he could muster. It's goddamn better. Now let's get down to business. You're going on a trip, all expenses paid. Desmond looked up suspiciously. A trip? To where? The States. Economy class, all the way. Jesus, not another hunt for Bigfoot, John, please. No, John said, removing a large file from his desk and tossing it to Desmond. Mothman, actually. Desmond ignored the file and looked at his boss incredulously. Mothman. You're kidding me. Not at all, John replied, easing his bulk back into his chair. Don't you follow the news? Reappearing about 60 miles outside of Point Pleasant near Hocking State Park. Spotted at some old campground near Rose Lake. Campground burned to the ground a few days later. Luckily, it was off-season. Only a couple of old-timers got broiled. All over Fox News Network. Sightings of some strange creature gliding above the flickering flames. That and some grainy cell phone footage of flickering lights in the sky. Just up our street, wouldn't you say? And to be honest, not sure how you missed it. You know goddamn well how I missed it. I was stuck in Bodmin Moor, freezing my ass off, investigating another sighting of the Beast of Bodmin. And what did I get for my trouble? A frozen dick and near case of hypothermia. You win some, you lose some, John shrugged. My contact in the States says this one is legit. Says he has proof. Proof? Desmond laughed. Proof that Mothman actually exists. And who is this contact of yours? Some drunken hillbilly, high on paint fumes and moonshine? Actually, no, John said, lighting up another foul-smelling cigar. "My contact used to work right here, exactly where you are now. He was a reporter for The Believer, but he was a real hothead with a big mouth. Kinda like you are, actually. But not half as good at his job, so I fired his ass. He moved to the States not long after. But an asshole is an asshole in any country. He didn't do too well there either, so he set himself up as a freelancer." "And he called you up," Desmond said, raising a quizzical eyebrow. "Why?" "Money, of course, why else?" "And he thinks you'll pay him for this so-called evidence. What is this evidence, anyway?" "Not really sure," John replied, scratching his stubby chin. "He wouldn't say." "Then why the hell should we listen to him? Sounds like a wild goose chase to me." "I'll tell you why," John replied. "Because he won't take a flat payment for this proof of his, no matter how much I've offered. He turned it down. Said he wants 50% of all sales from The Believer that month, and 50% of all follow-up articles and interviews hereafter." 50%? What the hell has he got? "Now that," John said, leaning over his desk hungrily, "is what you're gonna find out." The next day, Desmond stepped on the flight BB-3A, heading to Port Columbus International Airport. There, he would be picked up by John's U.S. contact and ex-employee, who would drive him the 180 miles to Hocking State Park, where the last sighting of the Mothman had been seen. The flight was a long one, over 12 hours overnight, economy class all the way, but Desmond didn't intend to waste them. He had John's file and his promise that if the story paid off, Desmond could take his rightful place as head reporter of the Daily Teller, and all the perks that came with it. Finishing his drink, Desmond fished out his glasses from his jacket pocket, snapped open the file, and began to read. The first sightings of the creature that would become to be known as Mothman occurred in West Virginia in a small backwater town named Clendenin. 5 men digging a grave in a local cemetery saw the creature fly low over some nearby trees. They tried to apprehend the creature, but it seemed to vanish into thin air. Shortly after, on November the 15th, 2 couples from Point Pleasant described a winged creature with glowing red eyes and enormous wings that repeatedly flew over their car and chased them all the way back to town. Over the next few days, there were numerous sightings of the same creature in and around the local area. On December 15th, 1967, the Mothman was sighted again, circling the Silver Bridge that soon thereafter collapsed, killing 46 people, giving rise to the Mothman legend as a harbinger of doom. Desmond flicked impatiently through the rest of the file, but it was more of the same. Drunken hillbillies with wild stories, and a few grainy pictures that could be anything from a kid's kite to a crane, or even a simple barn owl. Either way, Desmond was far from convinced. Just then, his cell phone let out a shrill cry and began to vibrate in his pocket, much to the annoyance of the old spinster that sat next to him, who raised one thin, quizzical eyebrow as he fumbled his phone out of his pocket before hitting the receive button. "Go for Desmond," he said into his phone, all the while flashing his best PR smile for the old girl who was now sipping her second screwdriver. His smile was not returned. "Hello?" Desmond said again. "That you, John?" But there was nothing. Only a deafening silence. Desmond shrugged, and was just about to hang up when a high-pitched shriek drilled through the phone, causing him to cry out as he thrust his phone away, shoulders hunched in pain as he pawed at his ear. "God damn son of a bitch," he hissed, looking at his phone and holding it gingerly as if it had turned into some kind of venomous snake. He could hear something now, a kind of sibilant whisper drifting from the phone, causing his skin on his arm to break out in great knots of goose flesh, making his scalp feel tight and uncomfortable. He slowly raised the phone back to his ear. "Go back," the words hissed through the phone. "Go back. Your future is still unwritten." The words were barely formed, garbled and strained, gasping into Desmond's ear. "Go back, or it's too late." "Who is this?" Desmond asked, his voice shaking, a cold sweat running down the back of his neck. "Who the hell is this?" But the line already clicked dead. Abruptly, ending the connection. And just then, the plane buffeted hard to the left, and a shadow seemed to flit across the moon. Desmond fell back into his chair, eyes tight shut as the turbulence rocked the cabin to and fro. Grainy pictures of the Mothman burned into his brain. 46 dead. The silver bridge a mangle of iron and steel. Cold river water. 46 dead, 2 missing. When a stewardess laid a gentle hand on his shoulder, he had just managed to bite back a scream. 8 hours later, Desmond stood outside of Port Columbus Airport, his collar turned up against the cold winter drizzle, waiting for John's U.S. contact, a man with the unfortunate name of Percy Titmore, to pick him up. The man was already 30 minutes late, but Desmond was glad of it. The flight had been a real stinker with turbulence and sick bags galore. He had left the flight, but now he was simply pissed. He didn't mind attending that strange phone call that had freaked him out, but now he was back in charge of his whirring emotions. He understood everything. The call had been a hoax, probably cooked up by this Percy character. Small show before the main event. Something to warm up the crowd, you might say. Desmond smiled and crushed out his smoke. If this son of a bitch wanted to play games, well, that was fine. Desmond could play games too. Just then, a small Honda pulled up to the curb and a scrawny man, probably in his mid-30s, with a shock of red hair and freckles, hopped out and approached. "You Desmond Bryan?" That's me," Desmond said, shaking the offered hand. "Good deal," the man said. "I'm Percy Titmore." "You're late," Desmond replied, looking at his watch. "Yeah, sorry about that. You landed right in the middle of rush hour, and your traffic was terrible, my man, just terrible. Moms picking up their kids, the whole 9 yards. Desmond grunted at this and threw his overnight bag into the back of the car. "We'd better get going then," he said, climbing to the passenger seat. "There we have a long drive ahead of us." "Yeah," Percy replied, ignoring Desmond's hostile tone. 180 miles to the Hocking Hills and a couple miles up the Old Creek Trail. We should be arriving at Rose Lake campsite, or what's left of it anyway, just before dark." "Why there?" Desmond asked. "Is that where your so-called proof is?" Percy ignored that. "No, my contact, the one with the proof as you put it, lives close by." "So what is it?" "John said you wouldn't tell him." "That's right," Percy said, an edge creeping into his voice. "And I'm not telling you either. Besides, you wouldn't believe me anyway. You just sit back there and enjoy the ride. You're gonna see something, all right," he said, a particularly nasty smile playing across his lips. "You're gonna be blown away." The rest of the journey was spent mostly in silence. It was just after sunset when the two men arrived at Rose Lake campsite. Desmond could not keep the shock off his face as he looked around the devastation. "God damn," he whispered, looking around the charred trees and blackened cabins. "Someone did a real job on this place." "Yep," Percy replied, handing him a large flashlight. "Thank God it happened in winter. If it had been summer, the whole forest would have gone up like a tinderbox." "Isn't this technically a crime scene?" Desmond said, looking around for a warning sign or police tape. "Nope," Percy replied, pulling on a heavy jacket. "Whole thing was written off as a freak accident. The investigating team surmised it started with one of the cabins, probably by a forgotten cigarette or such. And boom, whole place went up." "So no arson," Desmond sighed. "No oily rag or empty canister of gas. Doesn't make for much of a story, does it?" Percy shrugged and clicked on his flashlight, beckoning Desmond to follow as he headed up the trail. "Campsite is not what we're interested in," he said, over his shoulder, as he headed deeper into the woods. Desmond followed closely. He was a city boy, born and bred, and the looming trees and growing shadows made him nervous. "No?" he said. "Not the campsite. The Mothman." "Shh," Percy said, rounding on him. "Best not to say the name after dark. Some names have power." Desmond noticed the tremor in his voice, and the way Percy's hand kept playing with his waistband, as if seeking comfort. "Percy, what you got there?" "Protection," Percy titted, lifting up his shirt, revealing the biggest hand cannon that Desmond had ever seen. "Percy," Desmond said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Why would you need a gun?" "You will see." Before this night is through, you're gonna see and understand a lot more than you ever thought possible. Come on, he said, hurrying up the trail. Another 20 minutes and we'll be there. For a moment, Desmond considered heading back down the trail, but only for a fleeting moment. His curiosity was piqued. Whatever was going on here, there was a story of some kind. Desmond wanted to hear it. 20 minutes later, the two men emerged into a clearing in the woods. There was a large cabin here, and Desmond surmised correctly that it belonged to Percy's mysterious contact. The cabin was a long, single-story affair with a wooden porch that ran the length of the house. There was a light on, and as Desmond drew near, he noticed an old-timer sat in a rocking chair with what looked like a loaded shotgun across his lap. "Hey, Bobby!" Percy yelled. "It's us! Don't shoot, okay?" "Who the hell's that?" Bobby said, slamming open the porch door and aiming a shotgun into the darkness. "That you, Percy? Come into the light where I can see you." "Just take it slowly," Percy whispered into Desmond's ear. "Old Bobby's as nervous as an Alabama tick, and with good reason," he said, scanning the dark skies. "Better get inside and get this business done." "What business?" Desmond was tempted to ask, but Percy was already climbing the porch steps, hands held high. Desmond followed suit, raising his hands way above his head as he entered the dimly lit porch. "Close the door, Peckerwood," the old man said, eyeing Desmond closely. Desmond did as he was bid, keeping a wary eye on the shotgun that seemed to track his every movement. When the door was firmly shut, the old man seemed to relax and, with a sigh, flopped back down into his chair. But Desmond noticed his hand shook as he placed the shotgun nearby. "Jesus, Percy," he said, mopping at his brow with a gnarled hand. "Told you I wanted this shit done before dark. It was back again last night. Son of a bitch killed old Boomer." "Who the hell is old Boomer?" Desmond asked, wondering what he got himself into. "Shut your mouth, Leipe," the old man snarled. "No one's talking to you." "Fuck that," Desmond replied hotly. "This guy is the only one with the money, so you two had better start talking sense or I walk." Percy and Bobby exchanged a glance. "All right, Mr. Man," Bobby said, climbing to his feet. "You want to know? I'll show you what you're getting for the money. Show me. Follow me. Percy, you still packing heat?" Percy gave him a nod and pulled his piece. "All right, then. You dig up the rear and you watch the sky." Desmond could have laughed then, but he could also feel the fear emanating from the two men. Feel it crawl over his skin like biting insects. "Okay," Bobby said, as he rounded the side of the house and entered the overgrown backyard, dominated by a crumbling building that once served as some sort of barn. "Here it is, city boy," he said, pointing to a piece of blood-soaked tarpaulin amongst the long grass. "Go take your look." Desmond approached slowly, his heart thudding in his ears as he reached down and ripped the tarpaulin away, revealing the devastation beneath. It was a dog, or what was left of one. Desmond took one look at that bloody ruin and staggered away, drawing a deep breath as he fought with his twisted stomach. "That's old Boomer," Bobby said. "What's left of him, anyway." "Jesus," Desmond said, turning back to take another look. "What could have done that? His face is gone. It's just the bone." He saw, drawing a shuddering breath. "It's melted." "Some kind of acid," Bobby replied, covering over the remains. "Boomer was a good old boy. He didn't deserve to go out like that." "This is crazy. You're both fucking crazy," Desmond yelled, suddenly furious. "First that bullshit phone call, then this," he said, pointing an accusing finger at the bloody heap. But that was as far as he got. The butt of Bobby's rifle hit him hard in the guts, causing him to fall to his knees as he fought for breath. "Are you saying I killed my own dog, you cornholing son of a bitch?" Bobby said, grabbing him up by the collar and dragging him across the yard towards the barn. "Percy, get the door, goddammit! We're gonna show this city boy what's what." Percy glanced at the sky nervously, then quickly unlocked a huge rusty-looking padlock, before dragging the grating door open. "Vic the light on, Percy," Bobby said, dragging the protesting Desmond across the threshold, "and lock the door behind you." Percy hit a nearby switch and slammed the door closed, dropping a large wooden bar into place immediately, and the whole barn was lit up. At first, Desmond was not sure what he was seeing. It looked to be some kind of multicolored canvas stretched across the width of the barn. It took a moment for his tired mind to comprehend what he was seeing. There was a wing covered in fine hair that seemed to crawl and undulate with a mind of its own, its colors swirling, mesmerizing. "Mother of God," he whispered, climbing to his feet. "It's real." "Yeah, it can't be real." "But it is," Percy sighed. "And it wants it back. That and this," he said, dropping something heavy into Desmond's hand. Desmond looked down. It was some sort of pouch. The leather looked terrifyingly familiar. Skin crawling as if in a dream, he untied the ancient thread and emptied the contents into the palm of his hand. "Knuckle bones," Bobby said. "Human. Do the engravings?" Desmond said nothing. His mouth agape. The bones were black with age and engraved with runic symbols that made his mind ache just to look at them. "Take 'em," he said, thrusting the pouch back at Percy, who only nodded, stuffing the blackened bones back inside, before drawing it firmly shut. Desmond jerked forward as if drawn by an invisible string. As he reached out a trembling hand towards the waiting wing and gently stroking the fine hair, the wing immediately convulsed, setting him scurrying back with a startling cry. Suddenly he was aware of the looming night like never before. He could almost feel its oppressive weight pushing down on the barn roof. "Jesus," he clamored at Bobby. "You said it's been back? That it killed Boomer?" "Yeah," the old man said. "I heard Boomer barking. He was at the back door going wild, trying to get in. Boomer went nuts, barking and snarling. He charged the godforsaken thing, but it flew away. Thought it was gone, and then it came out of nowhere and snatched poor old Boomer up. I managed to get off a shot at it, and it dropped Boomer, but as you saw, there wasn't much left of him by then." The wing. Desmond was frantic now. How did you get it? How did it take Boomer with only one wing?" "You're another one by my guess. As for how I got it in the first place, I blew it off with this," he said, hefting his shotgun. "I was in bed when my chicken started flapping and causing a terrible commotion. Grabbed up my shotgun, headed outside. Expected to see a fox, but it weren't no fox, it was that thing. Top of the coop had been torn clean off, and it was in there amongst them. Must have heard me come and panicked, tried to fly away, but it somehow managed to get itself all tangled up in the chicken wire, and I managed to get off a shot. Now it screamed then, just like a banshee. It managed to tear itself free and shamble off into the woods, not for leaving that behind." He nodded towards the wing. "Shed it just like a lizard shedding its tail." "And a bag?" Desmond asked. "Found that the next day amongst the wreckage. Locked them both away in the barn. Gave old Percy a call. Told me they could make a shit ton of money from this and that, and he had contacts back in the UK, and that's you, I'm guessing. And now you have seen it, and let's talk money. I don't know what kind of arrangements you have with Percy, and I don't care. I want it gone from my property, so I'm willing to cut you a good deal. I want 20,000, and it's all yours." "Done," Desmond said immediately. "Shit," Bobby muttered. "Should have asked for more." "I'll write you a check right now," Desmond said, reaching into his pocket for the company checkbook. "To hell with that," Bobby said, raising his shotgun. "I want cash tonight, or I burn the damn thing and be done with the whole sorry affair." "How do you expect me to get 20 grand in cash tonight?" Desmond asked, his frustration mounting. "Well, that's your affair," Bobby replied, herding them out of the barn at gunpoint. "Just get it done. I want—" But that was as far as he got. Suddenly, a great shadow swooped down from the sky, and there was a deafening tearing noise, like a sharp blade cutting through paper. Bobby's head hit the floor in a shower of blood, bone, and gristle. His body convulsed, discharging both barrels into Desmond's shoulders, spinning him around, his face crashing into the hard, packed earth. Desmond screamed and flopped over, his hand going to the terrible wound, trying to staunch the hot flow of scalding blood. Shots rang out as Percy made a run for the house. He fired his pistol blindly into the air, leaping for the porch in a big, comical stride. The gun clicked empty, but Percy kept firing and screaming. His foot made the first step of the porch, and then a shadow engulfed him. And he was lifted howling and gibbering high into the air, before suddenly dropping, cartwheeling towards the ground. He hit the cabin roof with a sickening thud before bouncing down and onto the stone-packed earth. His face and upper torso covered in a foul-smelling slime that smoked and bubbled at his flesh. Desmond staggered to his feet, waves of dizziness assaulting his senses. His heart thudded in his ears as he frantically tried to escape the devastation and madness all about him. He was halfway across the yard, exhausted and bleeding, when there was a tremendous thud. Something heavy landed behind him. He tried to turn, but his frozen body would not allow it. He was only vaguely aware of the hot piss that ran down his leg as the shadow loomed above him.
You should not have come.
The Mothman screeched, not from a mouth not designed for human, his loathsome breathing spattering the back of Desmond's neck.
I warned you not to come.
Suddenly, there was a searing pain as a clawed hand burst through his chest in a welter of blood and shattered bone. Desmond's hands fell upon that terrible hand as if still not sure of its existence. Then, excruciatingly slowly, it was withdrawn. Desmond fell to the ground in a tangled heap, his vision fading as the Mothman's glowing eyes chased him down into eternity. I remember my father taking me to the far left side of the warehouse, all the way to the back against the wall, to browse the clearance section of the shoe store off of the interstate. And like any kid in the neighborhood, I'd run the soles off my feet. And when my mother finally noticed the holes, she wouldn't let me play until we went shopping. After having my size measured, the hunt began for anything remotely cool looking, under $20. Now with a family of my own, I spend at least 3 times as much on sneakers for myself. I mean, sure, my feet have gotten bigger, and there's inflation, but those are just casual wear. I need work shoes, which run 3 figures. Hiking boots for vacation, rainy season, slippers for the patio, dress for formal events, and flip-flops for the beach. Oh, and the kids. Well, they do half the running I do and go through twice as many shoes. And plus, there's my wife, Linda, is the shining light of my life and perfectly normal. Sorry. I mean, amazing in every way, and it's not an addiction, so stop calling it one. That's why it's so important to find a decent pair of shoes these days, and why I get so frustrated when the styles change or the brand discontinues the line. Hiking boots don't change that much, thankfully, not for a family of 4 vacationing once a year up north. The littlest one doesn't need any, really, not when he's being carried most of the time, but whines his way into a pair of his own because his older sister has some and I have to be fair. Sorry, I'm getting a little off topic. You're not here to listen to me vent about the shoe industry, but I could, if you like. No? Okay, well, you're here for something else entirely. It did happen on our hike, though, so I was getting to the point in my own roundabout way. Obviously, we took all the proper precautions. We set out before midday with plenty of food and water, multiple copies of the trail map, compass Linda swore we wouldn't need, whistles, which I might add are a terrible emergency device given to children, flashlights, diapers, and more than enough time to complete the shortest, easiest, most boring hike available 3 times before Din Din. Of course, something would go wrong. Do you have kids? By the time my ears could no longer tell the difference between Susie's new favorite toy and my old age, giving me tinnitus, I'm not even 40 yet, legally speaking, we'd hardly gotten beyond spitting distance of the parking lot and broke for lunch. Yes. Linda, I know that's where the park benches are. It's a good thing we didn't pack enough protein-rich finger foods with a low spoiling chance and easy cleanup so we could eat in nature or anything. I exchanged any number of garden variety suburban white guy head nods to other couples that we encountered after finally venturing forth into the open wilderness. There was a very nice black couple that we ran across as well, who also partook in said head nod. I didn't mean to be racist about it. Linda, it's a colloquialism. You know that. Yes, I remember what your father said last Thanksgiving. No, I don't agree with him. Well, yes, about the racism. The turkey was a little overcooked, though. Fortunately, the peanut butter gummed up the kids' mouths enough to put the whistle blowing on hold as we trekked alongside a stream and took turns looking through the one pair of binoculars that we brought along, trying to spot a deer or a rabbit or maybe just a falling leaf. I'm not saying you need glasses, Linda. I'm just saying our insurance practically gives us each a pair for free every year because I've run out of fun facts about ladybugs. We'd gotten to the third or fourth green marker, and really, of all the colors, they made green easy for a hiking trail out in nature when Susie perked up. She didn't quite get her sentence out altogether before handing me the compass that I'd forgotten I'd given her. I knelt down to her level like any good role model, and I told her that she needed to lay it flat on her hand for the needle to point north. I placed it on her palm, which I steadied, and suddenly her whining made a bit of adult sense. The needle was spinning out of control. I placed it against my watch, then my phone, hoping for some magnetic thing to reset it. No, Linda, I don't know if that will work, but for the price, you'd think that they might as well throw some in, you know? Sadly, the compass continued to rotate at random. During my perfectly healthy, even-tempered, well-reasoned, and mature mid-hike discussion at an average volume level with my wife over whether or not I spent enough money to get a real compass or not, Susie had blown her whistle again. Now, it would have been completely ordinary to hear it were it not for the absolute silence the forest echoed in response. I did my research. The forest only grows that quiet when there was a predator nearby. That, and really, we should have still been able to hear the highway. Yeah, Linda, even this far in. My darling sugar plum continued to blow on her plastic devil's tool until I took it from her, promising I only wanted to make sure that she hadn't used up all of her daily whistles yet. I popped it into my jacket pocket and grasped her hand to lead her back onto the trail, stopping when she pulled back. Shoes, Daddy, she urged. Yes, honey, I love your shoes. I remember buying them with you. No, Daddy, there, look! I looked out towards the direction in which her tiny arm pointed, preparing to spot a pair of old sneakers left by a lazy hiker, or worse. I didn't want to have to try and explain littering again, especially if I'd have to go off the trail to pick up some dirty shoes. I needed no explanation, however, as there was none to give. For my daughter had spotted, just beyond the tree line, a heap of shoes. A dozen pair, easily, of varying shapes and sizes. Curiosity got the better of me, and I told Susie to go find her mother so we could check it out. Naturally, she ignored the suggestion and tagged along. Yes, Linda, I know. She's Daddy's little girl. Thank heavens for that. Getting closer revealed even more boots. There had been hundreds of them, all piled up along a surprisingly steep gap in the earth. My mind went to some kind of sinkhole or ancient stream running through the ground, but nothing could explain the sheer number of shoes. My dad reflexes kicked in, just barely catching Susie before she leaned over too far and fell in. I didn't want to know how deep this thing went, or if she'd fall through the shoes like some awful foot-scented quicksand. I returned to my wife and made sure Susie held her hand while I went out and got the map. The compass still pointed every which way. We had plenty of daylight left. From what I could tell, we hadn't gone off trail, and even if we had, we'd have run into some sort of crossroads by now. I tried to put it out of my mind, making a note to report it once we'd returned. Yes, Linda, to the authorities. No, I'm not calling 911 about some shoes. We got back to the trail and kept going. I gave Susie the compass and gave her the ever-important job of letting me know if it stopped spinning. Keeping her busy would keep her from exploring too far again, even if she weaseled her way out of my wife's strong, independent hand. I read the... Yes. Linda, I know how to read a map. We've been over this. Oh, I would love to ask for directions. Yes. Hello, Mr. Squirrel? Can you point us towards the nearest public restroom? What's that? Oh, you pee on trees? I sure hope you wash your hands. Linda didn't think that was all that funny, but I got a good giggle out of the kids. The following hours were a parent's worst nightmare, or any hiker's worst nightmares. But trust me, it's probably worse with kids. I mean, most things are. We stayed on the trail, heading the single direction available, never coming across any other paths or signs or markers. Yes, Linda, I know we're on the green trail. Oh, you're right, that would blend in with the leaves. I should have realized that earlier. I started to worry when the sky started turning purple. I knew that we'd been out far too long on such a short trail to be lost. Worst yet, we'd come across the crevice of clogs again. Everyone was whining at that point. Long before that point, really. I'd kept as level ahead as I could. The forest had gone silent again, and for some reason my thoughts went to a strange place for a split second. Creatures in the woods go quiet around predators, and the only thing standing out was the pile of pumps. I wish I could explain the sudden primal fear that set in, with words. I wish I didn't have to even try. But some part of me, just a second too late, realized that something about the heap of sneakers, hiking boots, and sandals was malicious. I say a second too late, as though my mind had betrayed me out of sheer exhaustion, confusion, or shock. I shortly found out how foot-smelling quicksand worked, as Susie toppled over into the mound of moccasins. I leapt out to grab her, but the leviathan of loafers gobbled her up before I could get a grip. Finding her would have been like trying to find a pair of sunglasses dropped in a murky lake. Her screams died out quickly, as the last movement I saw was her brand new shoes disappearing into the stack of slippers. Yes, Linda, for the last goddamn time! I tried. Oh, she just slipped out while you weren't... Oh, you know what? It's not even worth it anymore. No, not shortly after losing my precious daughter did another group of hikers come by the trail. My wife waved them over and got them to go for help, and I only looked away for a moment before the entire Frankenstein of flip-flops had closed up, the earth smoothed from trail to horizon. I spent the night working with local authorities and volunteers, combing the area for my Susie, for the behemoth of boots, for any sign of a spinning compass, a feat which none could replicate. I explained what had happened so many times I could have memorized it, and each time it sounded insane. I know it was crazy, but somehow I knew it had vanished because it wasn't hungry anymore. I've been going out again each night ever since. I know it's still out there. I don't know how to kill a giant of galoshes, or even if it's possible. I'm pretty sure shoes can burn, though, and that's worth a try to me. It's been a couple of weeks now. No, Linda, I'm not letting it go. I'm not letting her go. The thing's gotta be hungry again sooner or later. And when it does, I'm diving in heel first. Death attracts the living. Always found that funny. The thing so many fear the most, splashed across front pages like tabloid fodder, made into bingeable TV shows to be consumed with a bowl of popcorn, the subject of videos made by internet personalities while they apply a full face of glam. Who isn't fascinated by the end? And what kid, given the chance, hasn't grabbed the nearest stick to poke at something, some unfortunate animal laying lifeless at the roadside? It's a fairly common impulse, I think, driven by innocent curiosity. But in my neck of the woods, where the skunk ape stinks up the Everglades and the Florida man roams free, some of us know better. That it's sometimes wiser to walk on by and let the dead rest. You never know when you're going to run across something like empty shell. Maybe I think all kids are body pokers because I was one. Back when I was young, before the age of electronics, with mothers who would toss their children outside and tell them not to come home until supper, I spent a lot of time walking the scrubland trails near my house with my friends. It wasn't uncommon to come across the body of some small critter, often a bird or a lizard. Stomach expanded with heat and trapped gases, its eyeballs already eaten by red ants. The less than fresh ones would sometimes burst after a few lazy jabs, releasing a miasma of stink and sludge. Gross, but in an entertaining way that pre-adolescent boys appreciate more than most. There was only one kind of body we never messed with. Tortoise shells. So if you saw one lying around just off the path, we'd push and tease each other to go give it a nudge, all while giving it a wide berth and passing with hurried steps. Names were called: Pansy, Baby, Little Bitch, but none were strong enough to override the stories we'd been raised on. Sure, there was dumb kiddie stuff, but deeply ingrained, like suddenly thinking Bloody Mary would actually be plausible while standing before a mirror in a dark bathroom. The same giddy fear that keeps people from invoking Mary kept us from touching the shells. Any could have been home to the terrible child-eating beast that was said to inhabit South Florida. Wayne thought we were dumb. He was a transplant from New York, not the city, but he still liked to think that he was some kind of De Niro. It could be hard to take him seriously. Scrawny ginger from upstate, trying to put on a Brooklyn edge, but we liked him all the same. He was funny. He'd fallen in with our group after marching up to us in the street, declaring his name and asking what the hell there was to do around here. It was the height of summer, perfect for long days spent showing our new friend the lay of the land. We took him around the pond, rode our bikes through the swales and ditches, and showed him the shanty fort that we built in the woods out of palm fronds and tree branches. He was there, attempting to hide from the stifling heat, that we introduced him to Empty Shell. He'd been boasting about the haunted house he lived in New York, where stuff was old and had history, as he liked to say with a smarter-than-you smirk. Florida didn't have that kind of thing. Ronnie had challenged him. Oh yeah? We got Empty Shell. Wayne scoffed, unimpressed, even as we told him about the monster. That was a made-up baby story, he said, not like ghosts. Ghosts were real and cool, and he'd lived with one. And we threw sticks at him until he shut up. The only thing we accomplished that day was lighting a fire under Wayne's butt to prove us all wrong. Gopher tortoises weren't that unusual in our area, but we didn't find them dead very often. Dad said that it was because they were burrowers, and when their time was up, they'd go into their hole one last time, and simply never come up again. Still, don't know how true it was, but as a kid, it made sense. Like I said, me and the others avoided the rare few we came across. Wayne took to touching all of them. "Oh no," he'd taunt us, tap, tap, tapping the tortoise shell. "Is it Empty Shell? Is it gonna get me?" Each time, we'd roll our eyes and call him a shithead, but we kept our distance. Our nervousness emboldened Wayne, and he started to actively call out to Empty Shell, inviting it to lay on our path so we could use it for a drum solo. Of course, none of us really believed in the creature, but we still side-eyed the long, gold grass that grew around the path. Eventually, his interest waned and turned to other things, and we finally got a little peace from the legend of the empty shell. I'd say we'd almost put it behind us completely, especially since Sandy Core had started sunbathing in her front lawn, and all the ruffled feathers smoothed over again. Until Wayne invited me to go out to the shanty fort to look at some magazines he'd found in his older brother's room. Since the others were busy, the two of us hopped on our bikes and headed for the trail alone. He took the lead, his bounty wrapped protectively in a towel against his chest. We were almost to the fort when he skidded to a halt, sending me into a swerve to avoid him. I demanded to know what his problem was. "Look," he said. A tortoise shell, larger than what we had usually found, was sitting in the dirt in front of us. I told him to just go around it. But Wayne was climbing off his bike. "Think it's dead?" he asked. I didn't really want to find out, and said as much. It wasn't that I was scared. I just wanted to look at the magazines. He ignored me, then walked toward it, goofy grin on his face. "Aw, is Whittle Billy afraid?" he cooed at me. "Worried empty shell's gonna eat you?" I sighed, bored of the game already, and positioned myself to ride around him. He nudged the edge of the shell with his foot, lightly at first, and when nothing stirred from inside, harder, the shell rocked from the kick. "Leave it alone," I told him. "It's just a dead turtle." "Tortoise," he corrected me. While he stared at me, waiting for me to retort, the shell twitched behind him. "Wayne?" I whispered. He said something. Maybe that I wasn't going to be able to scare him, or maybe just a mocking what? I don't know. All my attention had shifted to that tortoiseshell and the thing rising out of it. The pointed tip of a bleached beak emerged from the head, and it slithered outward and up and up and up. A large bird skull atop a serpentine, skeletal neck like a fleshless sandhill crane. It hoisted its shell body on 4 bird-like legs, scaly, black, long, and ending in 3 talons. Wayne turned at the same time I started to scream. He threw his bundle of magazines at Empty Shell's white skull and scrambled backwards, his colorless expression twisted in horror. The creature crouched low to the ground and scuttled quickly after him, completely silent, except for the light scratch of its feet over earth. Wayne opened his mouth, perhaps to yell something to me, but all that came out was a high-pitched, terrified wail. The end of Empty Shell's beak tore through the front of his thigh. I started towards him. I pulled back, then hung in place, torn between wanting to help my friend and horror at the thing attacking him. I shouted his name. Wayne reached for me as he fell forward, and his scream was muffled by the ground. Empty Shell ripped its beak through his leg, lowered itself, and pounced upon Wayne's back, its talons clawing through his thin t-shirt and sinking into his skin. Red beads of blood turned into rivers as he struggled beneath the monster's weight. I cried out. My head swung around in search of something to knock it off, but before I could find anything, Empty Shell reared back and it sank its beak into Wayne's shoulder. When it came up again, a strip of flesh hung from the end. Wayne howled and thrashed, which only made Empty Shell bear down all the more, raking and stabbing viciously. I tried to get my legs to move, to run toward my friend, but they had become wooden, unresponsive. I yelled his name again, and this time the thing's black sockets fixed on me, and it opened its stained beak to release a harsh, low hiss. Its neck coiled, and it pierced the center of Wayne's back, his spine. He gurgled and spasmed, and when his eyes met mine, I backed away. Slowly at first. And then I was running. A sharp, triumphant call, the shriek of a predator bird, chased me down the path. I looked back. Just once. Just long enough to see Empty Shell dragging Wayne into the long grasses. Just long enough to see the pleading, desperate light burning in Wayne's eyes disappear. I used to live in a haunted house. When most people hear me say that, they chuckle and don't usually believe me, but I'd seen undeniable proof of the ghost, whom I'd come to refer to as Patrick, or Pat for short, that inhabits my home. I mean, in fact, on a few occasions, I'd seen him with my own eyes. Typically, when people think of haunted houses, they think of old, dusty, two-story homes that were built on Native American burial grounds, or was the place of a death years prior. I can tell you now that neither of those things is the case when it comes to my home. My grandfather built this house after he married my grandmother, and it's been in my family ever since. After my grandmother died, it was inherited by my father, and after he and my mother passed, it came to me. And you might be thinking that Pat must be the ghost of my grandfather, or father. But no, that's wrong too. He's been around ever since my grandfather completed construction. It wasn't like he was there during the process of building the house either. Pat literally showed up the day after all the work was said and done. Obviously, this initially freaked out my grandparents. Nothing malicious ever happened, though, just some sounds of footsteps, the occasional sounds of the doors opening and closing, and the drop of temperature in whatever room Pat was in at the time. The thought of a ghost being in their home, however, it didn't sit right with them at first. They tried everything they could to banish him, called in priests, even an exorcist. Nothing ever worked. After many attempts, they had contemplated selling the house and moving away, but my grandfather just wouldn't accept that. He had built that house with his own two hands, and that pride wouldn't allow him to abandon it. Eventually, my grandparents learned to live with Pat. As I said, he was never malicious or did anything to cause harm. He was just there. After my grandparents died, my father thought that their ghost would linger around the house as well, but they never did. Pat was the only entity around, and it would stay that way. My father tried to learn more about Pat by researching the area where he lived, but never found any credible result. It was as if Pat just materialized out of nowhere once the house was finished. One time when I was a teenager, a group of friends came over and we tried to communicate with Pat through one of those Ouija boards. My parents had strictly forbidden this, so of course, being the teenage dumbass that I was, I decided to do it anyway behind their backs. This was usually the part of the story where all kinds of hell would break loose because of the Ouija board, but that didn't happen. After many unsuccessful attempts to contact him, Pat finally showed himself to us. And his body was faint, and we couldn't make out any real features other than the shape of his body. He looked to be about my height and weight. He had short hair, black dress pants, a white dress shirt. "Hi, Pat," I said in a quiet voice. He stood there and gave me a confused look, and then slightly smirked, closing his eyes, and he lifted his arm in a wave. I continued. "Pat's probably not your name, right?" He shook his head. Keeping the smirk on his face. I continued on. "Well, can you tell me your name?" The smirk left his face and was replaced by a sad look. He looked down to the floor, then to me. He shook his head again. I was guessing that he must not be able to speak, which made sense, seeing as there had never been any moans or wails or anything else vocal that you could expect from a haunting. "You can use the board," I informed him, pointing to the wooden box. He looked over to it, and using his finger, he spelled out DONTREMEMBER. He looked up at me again, still a sad look in his eyes. Is it all right that I call you Pat? I asked, for the sake of him at least having a name. He nodded, and the smirk came back. After that experience with Pat, my friends and I decided to look into other paranormal activities. We lived in Ohio, so there was plenty to look into. There's only one experience, however, that stands out from the rest, and it would be the last. After inheriting the house following the death of my father from a year-long battle with cancer, my mother had died giving birth to me, I turned it into a base of operations for my friends and I. We would meet there and plan out where we would investigate. This time, it was an old abandoned mental hospital that was known as the Ridges. It was famously known to be haunted, so I was particularly excited to visit it, as it had been a dream of mine to do so ever since we first got into the paranormal game. As we pulled up to the front gates in our van, I could feel my heart racing from excitement. I have to advise anyone thinking of doing this to, not do this. Not only is it actually trespassing, since overnight investigations aren't allowed, but what I encountered here scared the hell out of me. It scared me out of paranormal investigation for the rest of my life. It was when we stepped foot on the ground that the horror would really begin. After jumping the gates and walking around outside, I noticed something in a window of one of the upper floors. I could see a man standing there, staring at me. He was completely white from head to toe, white clothes, pale skin, even white hair. Something about him made me feel incredibly uneasy, and everyone else said the same. They all knew that something was wrong because never before had we been scared away from a location. Not this easily, at least. We got out of there pretty quickly. They packed into the van and we took off. Guys, said Andrew, who was sitting in the back of the van with his wife, Jen. My girlfriend, Jamie, and I looked out of the back window and saw what he was seeing. There was the man in white, standing in the middle of the road, the only part of him not white being his eyes, which were instead glowing a bright red. I could feel my heart racing as we all tried to register what we had just seen. Soon I felt myself start to doze off when Andrew once again exclaimed, "Guys!" I sprung awake as Jamie and I turned around. "The thing is following us," he continued. As we looked out of the window again, Jamie squeezed my arm. The man in white was directly behind us, and it looked like he was just standing in place. But he was somehow keeping up with the car. Now, at this point, we had all started to freak out, and I turned around to tell Bill, the driver, to speed it up as I turned back around to look out the window again, and I noticed that the man in white was gone. "Where did he go?" I asked Andrew. I don't know," he responded. "He just disappeared." We thought that maybe we outran it, or it just gave up. But then Jen started to act weird. Andrew had said she was feeling really sick, and she went to sleep on his shoulders. We didn't think anything of it, we just chalked it up to her being exhausted. When we got home, Andrew, Jen, and Bill said their goodbyes and left. We were concerned about Jen because, well, she still looked like absolute crap. We hoped that she was feeling better in the morning. Later that night, I began to feel sick myself. I felt like I was going to throw up. I ran into the bathroom, but nothing came up. Walked over to the sink, and I noticed how pale I was looking. I decided to turn in for the night, and Jamie agreed to stay the night to keep an eye on me. I fell asleep and was soon awoken by loud noises. My initial thought was that Pat must be active again, so at first, I ignored it. It just kept going, however. It sounded like someone rummaging through the drawers in the kitchen. And suddenly, there was a sound of crashing and screaming. I recognized the voice as Jamie's, so I sprung out of bed and into the kitchen, where the source of the noise was. Standing there was the man in white, standing over the bloodied body of my girlfriend. There were what appeared to be knife wounds all over her body, and a horrified look of pain and fear was frozen on her face. I screamed. I screamed in anguish at the sight of her corpse, and with tears of anger in my eyes, I ignored my initial fear and I ran directly at the man in white, tackling him and knocking the knife out of his hand. He put up a fight as I landed blow after blow on him, but I overpowered him surprisingly easily. Throughout it all, not a single drop of blood stained his clothes. He remained entirely clean, and the only part of him that was red were his demonic-looking red eyes. I reached over and I grabbed the knife, ready to plunge it into his chest, but suddenly, I felt a hand grab my arm. I looked over at it, and it was Pat. He was completely solid now. I could see more features. On his face was a graying goatee. His short hair also had spots of gray, and honestly, he looked similar to my father, with some minor changes here and there. "Don't," he said to me, as he took the knife from my hand. He placed the knife on a counter, and walked over to the man in white who was now standing. A look of anger was plastered on his pale face, and the red eyes looked even more terrifying. "No," said Pat as he grabbed the man by the throat. "Not this time." A look of fear replaced the anger on the pale man's face as Pat turned his head to face me. He gave me that signature smirk and nodded his head. I was completely confused as to what was happening, but I nodded in response. Pat then turned his attention to the man in white, still gripping his throat with both hands, and closed his eyes. Suddenly, a bright light came from Pat and engulfed them both, and I could hear the sound of a demonic wail as the light swallowed them and disappeared. "Jamie!" I exclaimed as I tried to approach her, but she screamed and backed up away from me. I looked at my hand, still covered in the blood that was not mine, and looked over at Jamie. It was at that moment that I realized what I had done. It wasn't the man in white that I was attacking. It was Jamie. She sat on the floor, her arms around her knees, and sobbed. I fell to my knees and sobbed into my hands. "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I'm so sorry." This was 10 years ago. I've never experienced anything paranormal ever since, as I've given up the desire to seek it out. Even Pat's gone. I never saw him again after he and the man in white were engulfed by the bright light. All my friends and now my ex-girlfriend are no longer part of my life. The reason the man in white took so long to attack me and Jamie was that he first attached himself to Jen. They weren't so lucky. Jen ended up throwing Andrew out of their bedroom window and jumped herself after realizing what she'd done. Bill was next, and he ended up getting hit by a car after running into the middle of traffic. After that was when the man in white possessed me. The only reason that Jamie and I are alive is because of Pat. He stopped me from killing her, and he saved my life in the process. Jamie understood the situation but couldn't stand being around me regardless. Seeing me kept reminding her of our friends, and she never forgot the experience of me nearly beating her to death. She left me shortly after she was released from the hospital. She claimed that she was attacked by a random assailant, so I never faced any repercussions for what I had done, even though a part of me still feels that I should, even if I was manipulated by some evil entity. It was my hands that hurt her. I never forgave myself. I miss Jamie. I miss all of my friends. Most of all, though, I miss Pat. He was there my entire life. I don't know what exactly happened between him and the man in white, but he's gone now, and I blame myself. I brought that thing into my home because I was nosing around where I didn't belong. Pat saved me. And Jamie, and sacrificed himself to do it, and none of it had to even happen. I don't know where Pat came from. And I don't know where he went. I don't know if he was a ghost, an angel, or something else, but I'm thankful that he was a part of my family for so many years. And I hope that wherever he is, that he's at peace. Hey there kids, this is me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I just wanted to tell you about a really awesome book that features tonight's author as well, Calls from the Forest. I know that I've done a bit of a promo with another story for Calls from the Forest, but it is available now through the link in the description below. Check it out, everybody, and on to tonight's story. The sunlight was starting to sink, and it turned a deep gold by the time Samantha and Patrick reached the summit of Mount Wixatonic. Sam put her backpack on the large, smooth rock on the ground. She pulled out 2 water bottles and 2 granola bars, tossing one of each to Patrick. They sat together in silence, looking out at the vista that splayed out before them. From this vantage point, you could see all of Harper below them, and as far as Worcester. The two sat with their backs to the sun, watching seemingly microscopic life go about their daily routines beneath them. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," Patrick said. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life as a tech in the emergency room." Samantha swallowed the last of her granola, taking a large swig of water before answering. "Okay. Well, what did you have in mind?" "Nursing school," he said softly, not turning to meet her gaze. "Nursing school," Samantha repeated thoughtfully. "You've been thinking about this for a while?" For about a year," he said quietly. "I've been trying to think of a way to bring it up." "Well?" Samantha took in a deep breath and held it for a moment, returning her gaze to the world below. "I think that's an absolutely amazing idea." She smirked when she saw his head suddenly whip around in surprise. "Really?" he almost shouted. "Of course. Why didn't you bring this up sooner?" She grabbed his hand, letting their fingers fold together. Patrick shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. "Well, first we bought the house, then there were all the repairs that had to be done, and I knew you needed a new car, and we just talked about trying to have a baby. Nursing school is expensive and time-consuming, so I guess I thought I was being selfish." "Babe, listen. Yes, we want to have kids, but we're both only 23. We have plenty of time. As for money, we'll figure it out. Maybe I can take a loan out from my 401k to help. And you're not being selfish. Wanting to improve your career before we start a family is about as far away from selfish as you can get." She kissed his lips and touched her forehead to his, smiling. "You're such a goober." They sat in content silence for a while longer. The sun had sunk low, casting the mountain's shadow for miles below them. To the southeast, tiny specks of neon light sparkled to life, some beginning to dance around each other like pastel fireflies. "Oh, look," Patrick said, pointing to the lights. "Carnival." "I read that there was one coming around. I think it's in Swinton." Samantha smiled. "You want to go?" "Most definitely." Patrick stood, offering her a hand up. "Let's roll, Starsky." Samantha stretched as she stood, and took one more look around. Her smile faded a bit as she looked towards the west. "What's up?" he asked. "I think we stayed here too long, babe. It's gonna get dark before we go to the bottom." She picked up her pack, slinging it around her shoulder, clipped it in the front. "We'll be okay. We've hiked up here before. I got my map just in case." He smiled and winked at her. "No problem." "Yeah, that's true." She playfully slapped his butt. "Let's do it, Hutch." Starting their descent, the couple laughed, joked, and reminisced about old commercials from the 80s as they tried to remember as many jingles and out-of-production products as they could. That then turned into a game in which each of them would sing the theme song of an old sitcom while the other tried to guess the show. "Okay, try this one," Samantha said, after wrongfully guessing the theme song from Perfect Strangers. She took in a breath and started singing, but Patrick suddenly let out a yelp as he stumbled and fell, rolling several feet down the incline and landing up against a tree. Samantha froze in place for a heartbeat, shocked by the sudden outcry and motion. Coming quickly to her senses, she turned to Patrick, who wasn't moving. "Baby, are you okay?" She knelt next to him. "Patrick?" My leg." He took a sharp breath in. "Okay, baby, lie still." She took out her phone and flicked on the flashlight, scanning the light over his leg. Both legs were covered in scratches and cuts, both fairly deep, and blood was running down to stain his socks a deep crimson. His left knee was deformed and swelling, and Samantha clenched her teeth and tried her best to ignore the churning in her stomach. She'd never understood how Patrick could be so calm around blood and injuries. She usually fainted at the sight of a simple cut, let alone the carnage that was on full display now. She fought waves of dizziness as she got the first aid kit out of his backpack. "Your legs are pretty cut up," she said. "And your knee is all messed up too, like, really bad." "It's dislocated," Patrick said, wincing. "I'm calling 911. Her voice was wavering, trying to remain composed. "No, I can't." His words were cut short by the sharp glance that she gave him. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Samantha dialed the phone and hit the send button. A ball of ice formed in her stomach when the words, "No service," flashed across the screen. There's no signal, she said, then cleared her throat. "I can't call out." "I can hobble down," Patrick said. "We'll find a big stick I can use as a crutch, and I'll just hobble down. It'll be fine." "How?" she countered. "It's almost completely dark out." "I don't really have much of a choice here, babe. It's too dangerous to go alone in the dark. What happens if you fall? We'll both be down in separate places, and it'll be pretty easy pickings for a hungry mountain lion wandering by." Samantha hung her head. "Yeah, all right. Point taken. Let's at least try to clean up the cuts on your legs so that you're not dripping all over the mountain." Patrick wrinkled his nose. "Patrick drippings. Gross," she said, pulling out the antiseptic wipes and gauze, unable to stop herself from smiling. "See?" Put his hand on her arm. "It's not that bad. It's like Nana always said. If you can laugh, all is not lost." Samantha leaned forward and kissed him gently. "Just get you patched up." She worked as quickly as she could, wiping dirt, leaves, pine needles out of his cuts and cleaning the wounds with wipes. She then wrapped his leg from the knee down with gauze while Patrick held the light for her. She found an ace bandage and wrapped his knee as tightly as she could. "Well, I'm no nurse, but it'll do," she said, standing up. "You did great, baby," he said. "Now see if you can find a real big stick I can use to cosplay Gandalf while we climb down Mount Doom." "You're such a nerd," she laughed and wrinkled her nose. "Stay here. I'll be right back." "Hilarious," Patrick said, mocking a deadpan expression. A few moments later, she returned to the sizable branch that forked at the end. With a considerable amount of effort, plus some grunting and more than one expletive, Patrick was back on his feet. The branch was a little long, but since they were on a fairly sharp incline, that worked to his advantage. He was able to stand on his own, but he would need Samantha's help to steady himself as they made their way down. "We're going to have to leave one pack behind," she said. "I can't carry both and help you at the same time." Opening both packs, she started to consolidate as much as she could. She managed to squeeze the food and water into her pack, but had to take the fleece jacket, tie them around each other for her backpack straps. "This will have to do," she said, standing up. "Ready?" "No. Let's try it anyway," Patrick winked. "What's the worst that could happen?" "Worst case? For you, anyway. I get rich off this crazy huge life insurance policy I took out last week." She wiggled her eyebrows. "My plan is all coming together." "You ain't right," Patrick furrowed his brow. "That's just wrong." "All right, hop along, Cassidy. Let's boogie," she said, as she gently slapped his butt. It took nearly an hour to travel about a quarter mile, with Patrick having to plan each and every step in advance. He was poking his makeshift crutch into the sloping ground ahead of him, testing for holes, rocks, sticks, or slippery leaves. There were a few times that the stick caught just the edge of a large rock or a large patch of moss-covered logs, and Patrick thought that he was going to go down. He managed to adjust his balance and stay vertical, much to their surprise and relief. It was full dark with no moon when they reached the first signal post for Dunn's Falls to signal that they were about halfway down the mountain. Both breathed a sigh of relief. The steepest part of the mountain was behind them, and in about 1/3 of a mile the trail would be much wider and have far fewer obstacles in their path. These were the trails that were mostly used for recreational hikers, mountain bikers, even a few joggers looking up to their cardio game. Once they got onto them, it would be far smoother sailing. Patrick leaned against the wooden signpost, stretching his back as best he could. Leaning on the makeshift crutch was not doing any favors for his spine. "Hey, babe, I need to take a minute here," he said. "Yeah, I could use a rest too," she agreed. "You thirsty?" Patrick slid himself down the side of the signpost, careful to keep his bad knee straight up on the way down. He took his phone out of his pocket, flicked on the flashlight, and shined it on his legs. He could see that his left knee was swollen, at least 3 times its normal size, even under all the bandaging. He imagined Dr. Sessler in the ER, his frizzy gray hair jetting out every which way as he stroked his beard and examined Patrick's knee. "I suspect you've injured yourself," he would say. Dr. Obvious, that's what most of the staff called him when he wasn't around. He had a slightly annoying yet somehow charming idiosyncrasy of always overstating the obvious in any situation. Patrick was pulled out of his thoughts by Samantha handing him a bottle of water. She also handed him a couple of pills in the first aid pack. "Aspirin," she said. "Thank you," he said, taking the pills and holding one in his hand. He pulled her close and kissed her lips. "I love you." "I love you too," she smiled. They sat for a moment and looked at a small cluster of stars that shone through an opening in the canopy of leaves overhead. Patrick glanced down at his phone to check the time. "We should get moving," he said. "It's about 11:15. With a small sigh, she stood up and dusted her bottoms off, then extended a hand to help him get to his feet. Once he was up and had his crutch in position, he leaned against the sign for a moment, and she put the water bottles back into the pack. Just as she was zipping the side compartment, an unearthly sound echoed through the trees. "Jesus, what the hell was that?" Samantha jumped. "Pretty sure that was a fisher cat," Patrick said. "It's okay, babe. They rarely attack people unless provoked." "That was not a fisher cat, Patrick," she said. "I know what they sound like, and that was definitely not it." "Well, there's only one other thing that I can think of that it could be then," he said. "What?" Her voice cracked. She hated herself for it. "Sasquatch," Patrick said matter-of-factly. "Looking to make you his forest bride." "You suck," she said wryly. "I'm sure if it's not a fisher cat, then it's some other small critter that makes a lot of noise." Patrick started to take a step forward. A loud crack silenced Patrick for just a beat before he screamed, falling to the ground. His phone flew out of his hand and landed several yards downhill, casting long shadows along the trees. He writhed on the ground like a serpent, unable to speak, only uttering guttural growls of agony. "Patrick? What happened?" Samantha was at his side instantly. She frantically shone her flashlight on him, trying to figure out what was happening. The light caught a glint of metal, and as she looked towards his leg, ice flooded her spine. The culprit came into focus. Patrick's right ankle was caught in a bear trap. The rusted metal teeth pierced deep into his flesh. "What?" Patrick's eyes flushed as he fought waves of pain, feeling himself blacking out. "Stay with me, baby. I need you to stay awake for me." Samantha tried to steady her voice. "Your ankle is in a bear trap. I'm going to try to open it. I need you to pull your leg out when it's open, okay?" Patrick nodded, still fighting the urge to pass out. "Okay," she said. "On the count of 3, yeah? 1, 2, 3. She pushed down with all of her might on the trap, trying to loosen the main spring, but it wouldn't budge. Patrick howled in pain and fell back, losing consciousness. "Shit!" Samantha took a deep breath and tried again. At least with Patrick unconscious, she didn't have to worry about causing him more pain. She again pushed down with all of her strength, but the jaws just wouldn't so much as move an inch. Patrick's eyes fluttered, but he didn't wake up. She sat back and put her face in her hands, blood rushing in her eyes. The only reasonable thing to do was to go for help, she thought. Even if I got his foot out of the trap, his left knee is busted up, and now so is his right ankle. There's no way he'll make it without being carried. With her mind made up, she untied both jackets from the backpack, rolled one up as a pillow and put it under Patrick's head. The other she draped over him as a makeshift blanket. She dug the water and granola bar out of the pack and placed them next to him within easy reaching distance. Then she went and retrieved his phone. She placed it next to the food. Thunder rolling in the distance. She looked skyward. She couldn't see any clouds from her vantage point, but the thunder was coming from the west. "Damn it. That's all I need," she said. The thoughts of Patrick waking up alone and injured on the side of a mountain during a thunderstorm made her sick to her stomach. and she needed to move quickly. She wrote a quick note on the whitewater rafting brochure that Patrick had picked up at a rest stop along the interstate a few months ago, telling him that she had gone for help and not to move. She put the note on top of his phone and kissed his cheek. "I'll be back as soon as I can," she said. "I love you." Samantha made her way through the darkness as fast as she could. The widened trails and the more gradual incline made it easier to move at a quicker pace, not to mention being free of the burden of the backpack. She used her phone's flashlight to light the way, occasionally stopping to check to see if there was any signal, her heart sinking each time in disappointment. The thunder was getting closer and louder. There was something in the sound that made her uneasy, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Somehow the thunder sounded wrong, and on more than one occasion she was sure that she heard the same unearthly sound they heard before Patrick stepped in the bear trap. It was closer than before. It sounded like an animalistic howl if it was filtered through the sound of an old dial-up modem. It seemed as though the sound, whatever was making it, was following her. At least she was within sight of the small, wooded parking lot. A single amber light buzzed lazily from its perch atop a small billboard, a map of the mountain on the sign. Moths and other assorted insects flew in tight circular patterns around the light, casting flitting shadows over the lot. Their car sat directly next to the lit billboard, just as Samantha grabbed her phone and began to ring, surprising her to the point where she almost dropped it. It was Patrick. He must have woken up and somehow had signal. She quickly answered, "Baby, are you—" She was cut off by a loud white noise and a hiss. Pulling the phone away from her ear, she looked down to find the phone was in video chat mode. On the screen, Patrick still lay unconscious on the ground. Oh dear God, she thought. There's someone up there with him. On the screen, the mysterious figure continued to move around Patrick, bringing the phone in close to his body and lingering on his leg. The video came to a rest on the bear trap stuck on his ankle. A crackle of static. Then the video shifted. The bear trap was now inexplicably off of his foot. Whoever was operating the camera was now holding the trap in front of the camera, and they were moving back up towards Patrick's head. Patrick's eyes flitted open and immediately looked towards the camera, eyes wide in terror. Before he could utter a word, the trap was thrust down violently onto his face, the metal jaws sinking deep into his skull on either side. He shuddered and twitched for a moment, letting out a muffled scream, and then silence. Samantha watched, horrified, frozen in place. The screen went back to static, followed by a blinding flash. Her hand was immediately racked in searing pain that quickly traveled up her arm, and in an instant later, she was unconscious. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself lying next to the signpost that she left Patrick next to. The jacket and backpack were still there, but he was gone. His phone lay on the ground, still in video mode. Blood covered the ground, the jacket, and the signpost. Spears of icy fear stabbed into her gut as she got to her feet. There were no drag marks, no other footprints, no animal tracks, nothing. It was as if he simply vanished. "Patrick!" she screamed into the darkness. "Where are you?" She fell to her knees, sobbing. Patrick was gone. Something was very, very wrong here. As she knelt to catch her breath, a scream ripped through the night air like a razor. "Patrick!" She held her breath and listened. Again, another scream that seemed impossibly far away. It was Patrick. She knew it was. He needed her. She steeled herself and stood up, limbs shaking wildly. She had to find him. She began to move, feeling like she was walking through water. Her feet were clumsily catching on rocks and twigs as she moved as quickly as she could in the direction that she heard Patrick. Lightning flashed, illuminating the tree around her in brilliant light. The thunder that immediately followed crackled and hissed. Much lower now, she could hear what had been eluding her before. There was a sound of static in the thunder, much like the snowy static on the television. The lightning flashed again, and the thunder followed almost immediately. She looked up in the sky, still completely clear, the stars shining brightly. The sound of the static and the thunder lingered in the atmosphere, echoing off the trees and rocks around her. A feeling of being watched crept its way down her spine. She turned off her flashlight, suddenly feeling vulnerable and exposed. The static was still hissing. Hissed in the air, and light form died as she shocked again. I'll go back here. A feeling of being watched crept its way down her spine. She turned off the flashlight, suddenly feeling vulnerable and exposed. The static was still hissing. and as the light from her phone died, she was shocked to find the trees in front of her were still illuminated with a flickering light. A fresh shot of icy fear shot straight into her heart, and she slowly turned around to look behind her. Sitting on a low tree branch, about eye level with her, was a small, flat-screen television. Snowy static filled the screen, casting dancing shadows around it. The thunderous static hissed from its speakers. Samantha blinked hard, trying to wrap her head around what she was seeing. Suddenly, the entire world felt wrong. The air smelled of electrical discharge, and the hair on her arms stood on end. The television's volume increased to almost deafening levels, and the snow began to fade, giving way to a picture. Patrick was sitting up against the trunk of a large tree, the bear trap still on his face. She could see his chest rising and falling sporadically, and wet, gurgling sounds emanating from beneath the trap. A figure appeared to the right of the screen. At first it looked like nothing more than snowy static, but quickly took on a humanoid shape. It moved like a man, but it was completely made of static. The static man moved quickly and silently in front of Patrick, obscuring her view of him, except for his legs. There was a fast flurry of unnatural motion, and Patrick's legs began to writhe in agony. The figure moved to the side, and she could see that the trap had been removed from Patrick's face. His eyes fluttered as the thing reached a luminous hand out and put its hand to his face. His eyes suddenly opened wide. Patrick let out an agonized scream. The creature joined in with its unearthly howl, both of which could be heard through the television and in the distance. Samantha stood with her hands clasped tightly over her mouth, tears leaving small, clean trails on her dirty face and hands. The lightning flashed and the television switched off, leaving her standing in the darkness. Her legs shook as her rapid breath came out in rasps. The pit of her stomach shifted and her jaws clenched. She fell to her knees and vomited so hard that she felt as though her back might break. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw another flicker. The static man was standing next to several large pine trees, silent and still. Though it had no face or distinguishing features, she could tell that it was staring at her. She pushed herself up on shaking arms, forcing herself to stand. The static remained motionless. Samantha began to back away from the thing, and after about 3 steps, it shot itself straight up into the air, creating a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder. Samantha stood and looked upward for any sign of the being, but found only stars. She stood frozen in a horrible state of decision. Should she return to Patrick to help him? Was there even anything she could do? Was he even alive? What was that thing? Would it come back? She knew her best hope, and Patrick's, was to find help as fast as possible. Her legs felt as though they were made of rubber as she began to move down the path again, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts and questions. All she knew for certain was that she needed to get help, and get back to him as fast as possible. It wasn't long before there was another flash of lightning and a crash of static thunder. Again, the static hiss remained. There was a bright flash, and a snowy static appeared in the trunk of a nearby pine tree in a vertical fashion, as if a television was turning on its side. The white screen once again gave way to a picture, and this time it was of a large dead oak tree in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. She could see the static man hovering around a branch about halfway up. His arms were moving rapidly, but it was unclear what he was doing. Holding her breath, she stepped closer to the screen embedded in the tree. The static man suddenly moved backwards, and a dark object fell. Samantha squinted and moved closer, trying to figure out what she was looking at until it became terribly clear. It was Patrick, hanging from a noose. The bear trap still attached to his face. His body twitched a couple of times, and then it fell silent. Samantha hadn't realized how close to the screen she'd gotten until it filled again with snowy static, and a loud hissing split the silent night air. The screen rippled, forming waves that moved like liquid across the surface, and a hand made of snowy static reached through the screen to grab her wrist. The static hand burned her flesh as she struggled against it, and she could feel her flesh bubble and pop beneath. She tried to grab a hold of the fingers to pry them off, but her other hand was shocked with a spark of electricity that left her fingers numb and paralyzed. "Please, no!" she screamed. The hand pulled her closer to the screen. She could feel intense heat and electricity as her face came centimeters away from the screen. The tiny tendrils of static reached from the screen and latched onto her face and burned like tiny matches. 2 large tentacles shot out from either side and wrapped themselves around her body. Intense waves of pain racked her as the smell of burning clothing and hair lit her nostrils. In one swift motion, she was pulled in with a sickening, sucking noise. And then the world went black. Samantha opened her eyes. Patrick's lifeless body hung 5 feet in front of her. His body was badly burned, and the bear trap had been reattached to his face. It was only a few seconds before she realized that she herself was in unbearable pain. Her hair had been burned off down to the scalp. Her clothes had been burned off. The nylon straps of her bra melted to her skin, but the cotton had burned away. Her arms had been stretched behind her and over a branch that hung at shoulder level. There was a noose made of vines hanging around her neck. She could feel liquid running down her legs, but she couldn't tell if it was blood, urine, or melted flesh. A flickering light illuminated the woods in front of her. The static man appeared and floated in between the trees, weaving in and out of them as if playing a game. It circled her several times, each pass coming a little closer until finally it stood at the bottom of the large oak tree. Slowly it ascended through the air until it was directly in front of her. She could feel it smiling, though it had no face. She could smell electricity over the scent of Patrick's and her own burnt flesh. "Please," she whispered. Luminous tentacles of snowy static shot from its side and then wrapped around the branch that she was standing on. Immediately catching the branch on fire, she lowered her eyes to see the thin branch engulfed in flames, and what was left of her lower lip trembled as her gaze shifted from the static man to Patrick. "I love you," she said, before the branch gave away underneath her. She fell quickly and barely felt the sharp snap in her neck. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the trunk of the dead oak tree, the one she was hanging from, the bark glowing, as static spread outward into the rest of the forest. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. Or listening to tonight's podcast on the podcast, if you're listening to that there at Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you could happen to listen to podcasts. I wanted to remind you guys also that my wife sells loose leaf tea at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocle-tea. She has different teas, including Creepypasta teas, and you can get a Mr. Creepypasta tea. If you ask for a dabbing sticker, she also has those. And of course, I wanted to give a big thank you to everyone who checks out patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta and supports the show, keeps the light on, gives me treats for my now 2 cats, both Hylas and Hercules. Both of them are a handful. And especially a big thank you to Saha, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mazikeen, Ken Lando Higuchi, Chompski, Nico kaeo, Tristain Pelton, Stephen VanHuss, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, G. Weevil 3, TheRedOakShieldVirus, Hades' Nephew, Carter Barenfanger, Dr. Strawberry, Jordan Wayne Deckard, Bradney Leipe, The Government Monitoring System, Anne Charron, rumblefox, AcidSystem, Mike Bullock, Rafael Rodriguez, Dan Sweet, Mad Marstomp, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Sean Mills, Brian Arce, Cryptic Nightmares, Shadow Morningstar, Somber Puppet, Brianna Wright, Someone You Love, Said the King 56, Bad Honey, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Patrick Schoolmeister, Thomas Burgett, Barbara Maceo, Bobby Carmen, Liam Newman, The Homeless Bird 93, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Last Blade Song, Eliminator 86, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, and Corey X Kenshin. A big thank you to all of you guys and everybody down there in the description. I really can't thank you guys enough for supporting the show. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And everybody who listens. Sweet dreams.